Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this evening's Landscape Transformation Basics Workshop. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Scott Kleinrock. I'm the Conservation Programs Manager here at the Waterwise Community Center, and I will be your presenter this evening. Just a quick note before we get started. There are a couple of web addresses on the screen that you might want to make note of. This presentation is available to download as a single PDF file with each slide as one page of the PDF, so that if you want to refer back to any of the text or pictures, you are welcome to do so. And the place to get that file is at the top link on the screen. That's cbwcd.org/presentations. And at that address, it'll take you to a page that is just a list of all of the online workshops that we present. And each one of those names is a link. And the easiest thing to do is to right click and then select download linked file as, and then save that to your computer. And so again, you can get that PDF at cbwcd.org/presentations. And there is also a recording of this workshop available on our YouTube page. So if you want to rewatch this to go over anything or share it with anybody else, you can do so at cbwcd.org/YouTube, and that will take you directly to our online workshop recordings. And just for your reference, in case you can't write it down before we switch the slide, I'm going to type both of those into the chat right now in case you want to grab that later. So the PDF is cbwcd.org/presentations. And the YouTube playlist is cbwcd.org/YouTube. And so with that, let's get started. Before we jump into it, I want to tell you just a little bit about the agency that I work for, who we are and what we do. We are the Waterwise Community Center. The formal name of our government agency is the Chino Basin Water Conservation District, and we're known as the Waterwise Community Center to the general public. We are a special district, so similar to a school district or a fire district, formed by a public vote back in 1949 to provide water conservation services to the western edge of San Bernardino County. Back then, the area was mostly agricultural. And so as the area has urbanized, our mission has evolved along with it. But we remain focused on preserving and protecting the Chino groundwater basin, which is an incredible resource because it provides 60% of our local water supply in an average year. That's an incredible resource for Southern California. Most areas don't have such a great local water supply, but we need to treat it wisely and we need to protect it. And so we say that what we do is threefold. We percolate, we demonstrate, and we educate. Percolation, as you can see here on the right, has long been the bread and butter of what our agency does. And that mostly takes the form of huge holes in the ground. If you live locally in the area, you might have noticed some of them north and south of the 10 freeway in Montclair or along Monte Vista Avenue. These are percolation basins. Most of them are literally old gravel pits, which have been re-engineered and reconfigured to take stormwater flows that are in our channelized storm systems or channelized creek systems, which would otherwise leave our communities, and capture those and naturally clean them as they percolate through the sands and gravel layers and help recharge our local groundwater supply. And that's how we work on the supply side of water conservation. But on the demand side of water conservation, we also know that the average house uses 60% of its water outdoors in the landscape in our area. And a lot of that water is not necessarily used intentionally, whether that's through leaky sprinkler systems, systems that run too often, or just watering lawns that aren't used at all. And so to that end, we demonstrate mostly through our free public demonstration garden at our headquarters facility in Montclair, open to the public 6 days a week, every day except Sunday. And you can see there are over 3 acres of Waterwise demonstration landscapes, many beautiful plants and landscaping styles to choose from. And we also do lots of education. everything from curriculum integrated K through 12 programs to free workshops like this, as well as more one-on-one programs for our local community members, helping people understand how often they should water their landscapes, how they should have their sprinkler system set up, looking for problems, as well as helping local community members transition to water-wise landscapes through a landscape design program. I'll talk a little bit about that later on. If you are interested in learning more about what we do, I encourage you to do a couple of things. You can check out our general website, which is cbwcd.org, but most importantly, I encourage you to sign up for our monthly newsletter, which you can do so at cbwcd.org/newsletter. We don't share your email with anyone else. You don't get any junk mail, just one email a month with all of our workshop and program updates, and sometimes some other gardening and water conservation content. I'll briefly introduce myself and why I'm talking to you about this today. For those of you who have just joined us, my name is Scott Kleinrock. I'm the Conservation Programs Manager here at the WaterWise Community Center. And landscaping is what I do. I have worked in many aspects of the landscape world, from horticulture maintenance to landscape design. I have a master's degree in landscape architecture. And before I came to work at the WaterWise Community Center, I spent the 8 years before that in the public gardens world, where I did landscape design, construction management, and horticultural maintenance management. But all through that, really one of my very favorite things to do is, one, be a home gardener, but also to be involved in DIY projects and to help people kind of make the most out of whatever situation they have, whether it's thinking about a rental situation where maybe all the gardening is happening in containers, up through a lot of in Southern California, helping people think about their traditional suburban front yards and backyards and transitioning from lawns or abandoned lawns that have turned into patches of dirt, to moving towards beautiful water-wise landscapes, which give us a lot more beauty, a lot more function than the water wasting landscapes that they are replacing. So that's why I came to work at the WaterWise Community Center. And one of my favorite things to do is to work with our local community members on helping them make those transitions. And so with that, before we jump into it, I'm going to launch just a very brief opening poll of 4 questions where you can let me know. Sorry about that. This workshop, we have 6 questions in our opening poll. And you can let me know just a little bit about who you are. Some of it gives us our metrics that we need to track and report on our programs. And then especially the last couple of questions really help me get a feel for who's in the audience this evening. I'll share some of those answers with you. And really, I can make sure that I focus on the information that's going to be relevant to all of you. So please take a moment just to fill that out, and then we will jump into the main program. See that some of you are starting to finish. Thank you very much. For those of you who are joining us from other areas not listed on the poll, please type into the chat and let us know where you're coming from. Everyone is very welcome. It's always very interesting to hear where people are. Hi, Karen, joining us all the way in Australia. I just heard that it is very, very hot in parts of Australia right now. Lots of people thinking about water-wise landscapes. We have Florida, Tucson, another Melbourne, Australia, Mexico, Sri Lanka, interesting, British Columbia. So we are located in Southern California. So a lot of what we talk about with landscape transformation, and especially going through the design process, is going to be relevant no matter where you are. Turf removal stuff is going to be relevant no matter where you are, but you will definitely, if you're not in a kind of California or Southwest landscape area, then you will get a glimpse of what gardening in Southern California is starting to look like these days. Welcome, everybody. And we have some people local. Okay, we'll give just one more minute as people finish up. We have local in our local service area cities: Chino Hills, Ontario; Montclair, Upland, Rancho Cucamonga, Fontana; San Dimas, South Bay, Redlands. Number of people in Australia. What time is it in Australia right now? I guess it's probably multiple time zones. Okay, so just to kind of wrap this up, a couple of things that I'm always interested in with this group. What is the current state of the part of the yard you're thinking about renovating? So we actually, in this evening, have a pretty even smattering across all of the questions, all of those categories. About 14% have a beautiful green lawn, 14% greenish lawn, 9% still call it a quote lawn, 12% patch of weeds, 16% bare dirt, and 19% already have a water-wise garden. They're looking to learn more. And then a number of people don't have a particular yard or project, but looking to learn more. So this class is for you too. That's very interesting, a little bit different than our normal results. And what are your barriers to moving forward on your water-wise landscape? 35% your time, 30% money and project cost, 12% finding a contractor, 40% is always our number one, coming up with a design. We're going to talk a lot about design tonight as we talk about many different topics. A few of you knowing how to take out your lawn, but just a few. So we'll probably go through that pretty quickly and also connect you with more in-depth resources for that. 30% knowing how to prepare the site, 26% knowing how to set up the irrigation and watering. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about that, but I'll connect you with a bunch of other on-demand online resources that we have for that. And some people knowing how to plant the garden. Again, I'll connect you with more resources for that, knowing how to take care of it once it's installed. And some of you already have a water-wise garden. So thank you very much for that. And then one quick note before we jump into it. How to interact with me or ask questions tonight. We have a pretty big group tonight. There's 47 people right now in the webinar. And so I don't have people raise hands and call on them because we find that there's a lot of downtime with the audio switching back and forth. And to keep things flowing, I encourage you to ask questions, but to do so, please click on the button in your Zoom interface that has two text bubbles and says Q&A. So there's that one with the two text bubbles that says Q&A, and there's one with one text bubble that says chat. Chat's great if you have comments as we go, but to ask questions, please use the Q&A, because on the back end, on the second monitor that I'm looking at, that keeps all of the questions really well organized for me. And I'll keep an eye on those questions that are coming in. And as I transition in between sections, then I will catch up and answer all the relevant questions that have come in. The questions I will be able to answer in the interest of time are going to be the ones that seem like they're going to be relevant to the general audience tonight. If you have more specific questions about how something might affect your yard or your situation, I'm happy to answer those, but I might need to hold those till the end of the presentation. And then I'm happy to stay for a while after 8:30 to answer as many of those as I can. Okay, so with that, let's get going. And what we are going to do is we are going to start tonight with a premise. Landscapes take up a lot of space in Southern California. For those of you who are joining us not in Southern California, if you're in a typical suburb, this applies to your situation as well. If you look at most of Southern California on a satellite photo, like something on Google Earth, something like that, there's actually quite a bit of green. Down here at the street level, it might feel like there's too much asphalt, too much concrete, and that may be true. But looking at an aerial photo of a typical suburb in Southern California is very different than looking at like New York City or downtown Los Angeles. And especially in our suburbs, there's a lot of front yard and backyard space. The typical lot, there's more outdoor space than indoor space. And especially if you look at the typical suburban front yard, for a long time, after I started working in the landscape world, the main question that I would hear about the suburban front yard was, does it fit in with the neighbors? That was really, really a big concern. And beyond that, if someone was going to go a little bit beyond that and do something a little bit different, the only question that I used to hear was, what does it look like? And what it looks like is really important. I think that everyone here should have a beautiful landscape, and I want my landscapes to be beautiful for sure. But the last series of droughts in California really opened up an opportunity for a new driving question when we think about our landscapes, whether they're front yards, backyards, or community spaces. And the question I encourage you to think about is, what does your landscape do? What do you want it to do for you? And what are you going to be getting out of the work, effort, time, or resources, whether it's water, products, or financial costs? What are you putting in and what are you going to be getting out of it? And one of the really exciting things is that shifting towards new styles of landscape, whether they're lower water landscapes or more sustainable landscapes, really give us much more than the traditional landscapes that they are replacing. So here's a picture of my front yard in Pomona, California, Southern California, in the early spring. And one of the main driving factors that my partner and I wanted our landscape in the front yard to do is to be a haven for local native bird, butterfly, and pollinator species. And so we built a front yard landscape of native plants that are good at doing that. And it's quite low water it every 3 to 4 weeks in the dry season. And if you build it, they will come. And so here is looking out of a desk in a window facing my front yard, typical suburb. You can see some of the plants are still growing in to provide a backdrop. And this is a black phoebe who comes and visits our garden all of the time and hunts for little insects and lands and looks around for them on this little perch. That's just an old branch that we dug into the ground. What do you want your landscape to do? What you want yours might be different, but you can think about that and you could build it. And one of the big ideas here tonight is California native and water-wise landscapes do more. And if you're joining us from somewhere else other than California, the native plants and native landscape types that are in your area will do more as well than the conventional landscapes that they are replacing. So what can they do for us? Well, as just a baseline minimum entry, they can be beautiful. Here are some of my favorite California native plants for home gardens, that most of which only require water every 3 to 4 weeks after they are established. So after the first year or two. Beautiful colors, incredible smells, many of them as well. And especially if you are working with plants native to your general region, you are also going to be building valuable and in most cases critically needed habitat. So in Southern California, in most of kind of suburban, urban Southern California, we're going to be talking about things, habitat for things that can pretty easily show up. So we're going to be talking a lot about birds that will show up, pollinators, as well as butterflies. And even if you feel like you're in a densely urban area and you don't think there's much around to show up, or you're in a very typical suburb that's still all lawns, front yard and backyard, it truly is, if you build it, they will come. I mean, I've seen gardens in the middle of downtown Los Angeles. You'd think there's nothing interesting around, and the most interesting little native non-stinging pollinators coming around to flowers. It's absolutely incredible. And that can look very wild. It can look more trimmed, and with using native plants, you can still have a lot of habitat value. And you might get lucky and have something like this, a hummingbird nest, and you get to see those hummingbirds grow and develop and eventually leave the nest. And all of this makes our landscapes a more enjoyable place to live and to learn. It's really something new all of the time. It's one of the things I love about especially native landscapes. When you're looking at a traditional, conventional landscape, It's a completely different paradigm. A traditional conventional landscape, you are doing a lot of work, a lot of mowing, a lot of trimming, a lot of fertilizing to essentially have a landscape that looks like a still picture. Ideally, it would look the same for as much of the year as possible. Green, flat lawn, maybe a few roses that bloom for as long as possible, and lots of water, fertilizer, and work to keep it that way. Ideally, it wouldn't change at all. Conversely, if you're working with a native landscape, you're embracing that seasonal change. There's always something new, always something shifting. You're valuing the seasons. And especially in a landscape like California, you can have plants flowering every single month of the year. Something's coming in spring, other things really wait more towards summer, even in the fall, even in the winter. There's manzanitas that can be blooming, or some of our other native plants, wildflowers in the spring, which will then dry out in summer and set seeds and turn into bird food. And all of this is just really amazing to experience. And then even the wildlife that shows up, you'll start tuning into the fact that different birds will show up at different times of the year, but kind of keep to their schedules. And you'll start to learn the patterns of their coming and going. And so whether it's for you to enjoy, which is the most important thing, but also for your kids or your grandkids that might come and visit, these sorts of landscapes are really interesting, dynamic spaces. And so a lot of people think, well, I have kids, I need to have all lawn, but really, water-wise and native landscapes can be just as or even more compelling. And it's definitely not all or nothing. So if you have a kid who's learning to play soccer or learning to walk, definitely you might want some lawn. But think about what lawn is going to be your functional lawn and how much of it you need. And if you're never going to be using the lawn, for example, in your front yard, maybe you can have something really interesting and very low water and extremely sustainable in the front lawn or in the front yard, and then keep the lawn in part of the backyard. And so all of this together, especially if you're going to be working with the plants native to your general region, also provide a really unique and interesting sense of place wherever you are. I really like this quote from former First Lady, Lady Bird Johnson, who was an advocate for working with native plants in landscaping. And she said, native plants give us a sense of where we are in this great land of ours. I want Texas to look like Texas and Vermont to look like Vermont. And I'm a little bit more cynical than Lady Bird Johnson, but my take on it is it costs so much to live in California. And if I am lucky enough to have a little patch of land where I can decide what's going to be growing there, why would I want my yard to look like a parched imitation of an East Coast or really a European traditional landscape style in the middle of summer, no matter how much work I do? Rather than that, I want to wake up to the natural beauty of California every day and enjoy it every evening. And I do that through having native and water-wise landscapes. And so it could look like a number of different things. I really like this front yard in Pasadena, Southern California. You can see here the credit to the Theodore Payne Foundation Native Plant Garden Tour. They generously let me use images from their garden tours that I've taken myself, as well as ones that they have taken. They are a nonprofit located in Southern California, dedicated to promoting the conservation and use of native plants. And a lot of that is through urban landscaping. They have an incredible nursery, and every spring they offer a really incredible garden tour. Great chance to see lots and lots of different styles of residential landscapes, from DIY to really high-end contractor installed things. So definitely check that out if you are in Southern California. So this particular landscape was first project done by the homeowner, First Native Garden, designed and installed. He took a number of classes to kind of get an idea and learn how to do things. He also took some plant propagation classes and grew some of the plants himself as well. Very impressive. But this was not a huge front yard, and it was on a side street, but pretty close to a pretty busy street. And so by putting in this landscape, not only is he getting beauty, not only is it something much more interesting to look at from the windows of the house, but it totally changes the feel of the property. If this was just flat and lawn, it would feel pretty close to the traffic, pretty close to the street. And now with all of these layers, it kind of sets the house to feel like it's a little bit kind of its own retreat in a little bit of nature. And I think it's quite beautiful, lots of color from flowers, from foliage contrast. But even if that's a bit of a wild look for you, you can still work with water-wise and native plants and have a little bit more of a clipped and trimmed look. So this is another quite water-wise compared to a traditional landscape, about 80%, probably 85% California native, with most of the rest of the plants being Mediterranean climate and water-wise plants. And so if this sort of look is more appealing to you, you can definitely go for that as well. The turf alternative is yarrow. It's a herbaceous California native plant that can take mowing and is more of a medium water use plant, but definitely way less water requiring than a traditional green lawn. So it can look like anything that you want to as well. Okay, so all that's great, but where do you start? Well, one of the big ideas from this class is not here. No matter how good a local specialty nursery might be, and this is a picture from the nursery at the California Botanic Garden, an incredible local resource for us here in the Inland Empire or Eastern LA County areas. But the reason why you don't start at the nursery, even a really good one with knowledgeable staff, is because you want to know what you want going in. Because when people hit the nursery, even if there's great plants there, what ends up happening is they buy one of this and one of that, and something has a really beautiful flower, and you buy it, not quite realizing until you get home and reread the label that it's going to be 12 feet wide, and you don't have a really great space for it. And maybe you buy too many plants that want full sun, but you don't have enough full sun to accommodate them all. And plants end up crammed too close together, growing into each other. They become harder to maintain, and they're not set up optimally for success, either for themselves as the plant or for you to maintain them if they're planted too close together or not in the right conditions. And certainly not to end up with a coherent, beautiful looking design in the long term when we're talking about 4, 5, 6 years out. And so where you want to start is with your goals. Think about your goals before you start thinking about plants. And so here is a list of goals from probably the hardest residential clients that I ever worked with. And the reason why is because they were my parents, and I had been used to working with people who wanted to work with me because of my knowledge and competence. And then I was helping out my parents who were never really interested in this stuff. But when the first round of turf removal rebates hit Southern California, it was a really good deal. And my father's list of goals was actually pretty easy. It was, I don't really care, whatever makes your mom happy. But my mom had a huge list of goals that she wanted to fit into a relatively small backyard. So I'll show you pictures in a moment, but starting with the list of goals, because that's what comes first. A comfortable place to sit and read, a place that feels relaxing, the sound of water to dampen the noise of the suburban neighborhood, all the string trimmers and leaf blowers that we're still going to be going to maintain all the other yards around, something that'd be relatively simple to maintain, something to hide a less than attractive cinder block wall that goes all the way around the backyard without spending a lot of money, something to attract birds, something that would look nice, a small space to grow some vegetables, and to cram that all into a small backyard while somehow making the small space feel bigger. And we can accomplish that through the design process, which we will talk about throughout much of this workshop. However, we're not going to accomplish this if we just hit the nursery and start buying plants, even if they are great plants. And so we have resources for those of you in either California or Mediterranean semi-arid climates. We have the resources to help you with the plant selection part, but we'll get to that later after we think about many other things that we should be thinking about first. And so to quickly show you as a teaser how that project went, we have April 2015. Here's the yard. This is planting day. We had our planting concept. We got our plants and planting mostly from small 1-gallon plants, a few plants even smaller, 4-inch plants, and then just some of the trees and plants that we couldn't find in a smaller size as 5-gallon. In general, you always want to plant generally as a 1-gallon plant unless you have a specific reason not to. And so after planting, this is what your landscape might look like. And if you're working with plants that get bigger, it might even be more sparse. And it's a very typical reaction for people after planting to think, oh my gosh, the plants are so small, they're never going to grow in. I should have planted twice as many plants. I should have bought bigger plants. If you've done the research that we're going to talk about, if you figured out you're putting the right plants in the right places where they're going to thrive, and you've measured out the size that they're going to be, you've taken that into account, just give it a little bit of time. And so this was April, and this is October of that same year. Truly, the plants will start growing, and sometimes it's amazing how fast they will start to grow in. And so if you went and you bought twice as many plants because you're thinking it's going to take too long to fill in, by sometimes only 6 months out, but definitely by 2 or 3 years out, you'd have to be removing a ton of plants. And oftentimes people wait too long to do that. So if you do your homework, just have a little bit of faith. And so here we go. So the concept to accomplish all of those goals for this project was a lowish water, kind of mixed Mediterranean meadow, working with this California native Berkeley sedge as a small grass-like plant that's repeated. So if we just went to the nursery, there's no way that I would have thought to buy this much Berkeley sedge, but we decided to use that as a simple kind of main plant with then lots of different accents all around. And so here we have the sound of water. This is a big pot that got drilled out more underneath and got turned into a water feature. The place to sit and read. Here you can see how narrow this yard is, so looking back at the main house, but by setting up the different features to create their own sense of space with each one, that's how we were able to add things to the small yard while still make it kind of feel bigger to be inside. So from the other corner of the yard, where the yard gets even narrower, we had room for one raised vegetable bed. So it's looking back at a lemon tree. It's one of the 2 trees that was in the yard that we were able to save. And it really is, if you build it, they will come. So this wasn't even a hugely habitat focused yard, but just providing a clean source of recirculating water will bring all sorts of bird life to the garden. So this is Van Nuys, Southern California, and a falcon coming by for a drink right in the middle of that all. And so you can see some of our seasonal pops of color, mixing in Australian kangaroo paws, South African red hot poker in the background for some spring color, both Mediterranean climate water-wise plants. And so that's just one example of how to accomplish that. Some other inspiration, just to give us a few glimpses of what things might look like. Doesn't need to be any one look, like I mentioned. So here we have a very kind of modern style front yard, but simple, still working with native plants. So this happens to be closer planted and probably mown a little bit more often, Berkeley sedge, the same plant we used in that backyard project, with taller native ornamental grasses. And here we have a redbud and a sycamore tree. So a couple of trees that will be great habitat and great shade over time. And a lot of these spaces, you end up seeing these amazing patio spaces working with organic kind of shapes and quite inexpensive materials. So this gravel patio, very inexpensive to install, very sustainable. Gravel usually comes relatively locally for wherever you are. When it rains, the water can just soak down. Not a lot of environmental impact compared to like concrete patio. And then the look is really nice and natural as the gravel just kind of sweeps into becoming the mulch for some of the water-wise and native plants nearby. You start seeing social spaces show up in front yards. People actually want to spend time in these spaces as opposed to the abandoned lawn with a few brown patches, which is much more typical. And I've had so many people who have redone their front yards to native or water-wise landscapes say that they met more neighbors in the process of doing that than they had met in the 10 or 15 years that they had been living in the house before that. I hear that all of the time. And then especially once they start spending time out in that space, even more so. Here's another picture of that somewhat more formal landscape, working with native plants, but in larger swaths to create typical kind of hedges and ground covers. Or this more modern style where they're working with very linear, large size pavers interfilled with decomposed granite that then becomes the ground cover. And that allows for a very wild and natural looking landscape, but kind of still holds together in a very intentional design. Or you might be partial to a much more organic looking design. This is personally really in line with my style. And I just love the look of this decomposed granite winding path with natural local river rock, cobble edging, and then a mixture of California native flowering perennial and meadow plants. So it doesn't need to look like any one thing. And for those of you who are joining us from elsewhere, you can do some research into what would be your appropriate local garden styles. Most states have different native plant enthusiast groups or native plant societies, oftentimes with really, really experienced gardeners. And that's always a great thing to look into and to see if there's local garden tours established or set up by them. Oftentimes those happen annually, and really great ways to find your inspiration. For those of you in most of Southern California, rebates are available to help make it happen. So I promised in the description that we will cover the rebates for people in Southern California. If you're not in Southern California, just bear with us as we get through this. Just going to be a few minutes, and then we will get into more relevant content for everybody. And so if you are in Southern California, chances are, no matter who your actual water provider is, there is going to be a central place to get most of your rebate information. It's always a good idea to check with your local water provider. You can often find information on their website, or you can call them and talk to a customer service person. Oftentimes there's additional water conservation programs and incentives locally, but the largest ones these days are generally done through the Metropolitan Water District, which is Southern California's water wholesaler, which then sells imported water to your water supplier. And so to keep things simple regionally, there's kind of a central hub, which is SoCalWatersmart.com. That's the website typed here, SoCalWatersmart.com. And there's a number of different rebates. You can also find out on there if you qualify. There's a kind of estimate my rebate for different programs. And so you can qualify and find out exactly what your rebate would be. The largest one for people thinking about landscape transformation, if you currently have turf grass, doesn't need to be a beautiful lawn, could be pretty patchy, or it can be brown as long as that thatch is still there. Can't be down to dirt or weeds. That's going to be available. We'll talk more about that because that's the big one. There are also rebates for modern style of irrigation controllers. The box that often is in your garage, that's a mystery to many people, tells your sprinklers when to turn on and off. There are rebates for a new generation of irrigation controllers, which will automatically adjust if they are programmed correctly to change based on the weather and potentially help you save quite a bit of water. In addition to that, most of the ones these days that are available, if you can have them be within the range of your home Wi-Fi system, or if you can extend it, then instead of having to type something on a screen with just a couple of buttons in the garage, you can log in from your phone or from your computer and get an interface that's much easier to work with. It's much easier to be outside and turn things on and off to test different areas, make sure you don't have leaks. So I highly encourage you to look into that. And there's some additional ones as well. Also the place where you would look for rebates if you get a high efficiency washing machine or something like that. So check out everything that they have. For people in our local service area, basically, if you get your water from Monte Vista Water District, Ontario, Chino Hills, Cucamonga Valley Water District, Fontana, or Upland, there are also additional rebates and programs available from your water providers. One of them is a completely free and installed by a professional landscape contractor, weather-based irrigation controller. So instead of needing to go through that rebate and figure out how to install it yourself, you can, for the full details, get in touch with your local water supplier. You can just call them and ask to talk to the conservation person about the irrigation controller program. But basically you do an online class and you can sign up, and then you can you can schedule to get on the list to have the contractor come and install that for you. As long as you have a current irrigation system that is functional enough that installing that controller could help potentially save some water. And they check and they tell you what you need to change in order to get there if that's not the case. And so for most of us in Southern California, through that SoCalWatersmart.com program, you can get a turf replacement rebate. You get paid per square foot, or you get rebated per square foot of turf removed up to 5,000 square feet per fiscal year. And their fiscal year is basically from July 1 through June 30th. So you can, for example, do your front yard one year, your backyard the next year, and that's just fine. And it's at least 250 square feet, unless you have a really tiny yard and the whole yard is less than 250 square feet, up to 5,000 square feet. The base rate for that is $2 a square foot. That is the minimum. And then depending on where you are, your local water agency may have kicked in more matching funds to increase that. And so when you type in your estimate your rebate at SoCalWatersmart.com, it will tell you what you would potentially qualify for based on who your water retailer is. I'm going to provide a few tips for participating in that program based on the questions that we get from people most often. The most important thing to understand is this is a program specifically rebating removing turf and installing a water-wise garden. So if you don't have turf, even if your turf is brown, that's fine. But if you don't have turf, you will not qualify. Additionally, at the time you apply for the program, so that is before you do anything, your turf still has to be in and you will apply. You have to wait until you have received approval for your rebate. You're basically your placeholder for those funds before you can start doing any work. So you can't take out your turf until you get that approval. From the date of your application, providing everything that they ask for, it's usually about a couple of weeks or so, depending on the demand at the time. And so to get all of the details, go to SoCalWatersmart.com, click available rebates and go to turf replacement program. Read through all of that before you get started. But here are some quick tips. You are going to need to know your total lot size. So not just the size of the area that you are going to be replacing or renovating the landscape. In addition to that, you'll also need to know your total lot size just for their metrics. If you don't have that handy, easiest thing to do is to go to any search engine and type in your address. Even if your house is not for sale, the real estate websites just have these databases that will automatically generate a profile for any property. Depending on which website it is, you'll have to look for it. It'll be somewhere. This happens to be Zillow. This result is in acres because this is the address of our headquarters facility, a large commercial site. But for the vast majority of people, when you get to this area, it's going to have the square footage of your lot size. You will need to have decided in advance which areas of your turf will be transformed and how many square feet each for your front, side, and or backyard is the number of square feet that will be removed. That's how they're going to calculate and save the funds for you so that you can apply officially when you are done for them cutting the check for you, and they know that they're going to have those funds available. And so there's the initial application, and then later on after you're done, you provide the photos, and then they will process your rebate check. And so you will be upfronting all of the cost for the project. And so this may or may not cover the entire cost of your project, depending on many factors. We'll talk about project cost a little bit later on. How you would get those numbers. You can measure areas by hand, and that's always going to be the best. If you have relatively simple landscape areas, doing rectangles or relatively simple shapes, just go out and measure and do some math and estimate. If you have a really strange shaped site, sometimes people on cul-de-sacs have these very hard to measure kind of trapezoidal shaped lots. One tip is you can actually use the Google Maps website to do a basic measurement that will get you close enough in most cases, as long as you don't have a lot of tree cover. Go to Google Maps. So the website is maps.google.com. Type in your address. When that comes up, you can click in the lower left of the map and change the map view to an overhead aerial photograph view that's updated every few years. From there, you can zoom into your property as much as possible, and then you can right click, and that gives you some more options. So if you right click, you can select measure, and that will automatically start for you a little connect the dots function. And when you connect the dots over the area of landscape you're going to remove, it will give you an estimated area measurement, which is normally close enough. It's not quite as accurate as measuring with a measuring tape, but it's pretty good. In addition to that, you're going to have to let them know which, quote, stormwater retention feature you're going to install. That's one of the requirements of this program. It's also something good that we should really all be thinking about, especially in dry climates, but for water quality purposes, often even in wetter climates, it's something to be thinking about. And in wetter climates, sometimes those are called rain gardens. So which stormwater retention feature? So basically, in addition to using water-wise plants to save water, because you are getting rebated to essentially take out conventional turf landscape and put in an exemplary garden. Part of an exemplary garden in the year 2021 is not only having low water demanding plants, but it's doing something so that when it rains, you're capturing some of that water, holding onto it and letting it soak into the soil. In a small rain event, that's just going to give the plants nearby a good extra soak. But in a large rain event, that will actually contribute to local groundwater recharge. Very important because everybody is needing to rely more and more on local water supplies these days in most areas. Areas that are not relying on it yet, in many cases, are looking into the technical barriers to them doing so, because everybody knows that imported water is less and less reliably available these days. And so if you are doing the turf replacement rebate, you're going to have to choose from a few different names: rain garden, rock garden, dry riverbed, swales, berms, rain barrels, or cisterns. And there are profiles of kind of descriptions of each of them. But if you're doing something, and often for most people, it's going to be a small depressed area, maybe with rocks to allow some water from usually the roof to soak in, you can just select the name that seems closest to you. As long as it works, you're going to be just fine. And then you're going to need to know the total number of plants that you will be planted. An estimate. A few things change, that's not going to be a big deal. The project requirement is that you plant at least 3 plants per 100 square feet to be planted. So basically, if you are getting a rebate for 1,000 square feet, that's going to be at least 30 plants, and your number is going to need to at least match that. That's not a hard number to meet. Most of the time, if I just design a nice looking landscape, it's going to easily surpass that amount. You also need to upload through the website a copy of your recent water bill, a copy of your landscape plan. Don't be intimidated by that. This does not need to be a work of art. I've seen a lot of plans that have been approved, and some of them look like they were drawn by a 7-year-old who is not particularly good at art for a 7-year-old. So don't let it be intimidating. It can be a very rough sketch of the shape of your yard, just freehand, and just kind of minimum. Here's where my dry stream bed is going to be. Here's where I'm going to put a tree. Here's where I'm going to have some native plants, and maybe here's where I'm going to put an herb garden. Something like that will be just fine. Then you can officially request your approval. Couple of weeks normally, and you will get an email saying you have been approved. Then you can start your work. The day you get that approval notice, you will have 180 days to complete the project and then upload photos and request your rebate. And then, very important kind of last thing on this is, it's a great deal. However, federal tax law is that rebates over $600 will be taxable on your federal income taxes. So if you get your $10,000 rebate, that's a great deal, but you are going to owe taxes on the majority of that. So definitely plan for that so you don't get hit by surprise. And you'll receive tax documentation in the mail from the Metropolitan Water District for that at the end of the year. And so just a quick example, this was my front yard when I applied for the rebate. So I hadn't been watering the lawn. Looks pretty dead, but you can see that that thatch is still there. That qualifies. And so with that, we will be moving on to talking about the stormwater retention feature requirement. And so this is a requirement for the rebate, but this is something, again, that we should all be thinking about, rebate or not, in 2021 when we redo a garden. It's not just about plants. It's also about resource management to some degree. And how do we take rainwater and really cherish it like the resource that it is, while having it contribute to the beauty of our landscape. But before we jump into that, let me stop and check in on some questions. Okay, from Jolene, how can you change it? Can you switch in phases over to a water-wise garden is the question. Absolutely, you can switch in phases. It's not all or nothing. And in fact, especially I would encourage people, if they're doing this for the first time, don't try to do your whole property, your whole front yard and your whole backyard all at once. It's better to start smaller with a manageable project size and build on that to be successful. However, the one thing that you are going to really need to think about is how your new landscape is going to get watered. Because, for example, depending on how your irrigation system is set up, you will have very different irrigation requirements, both in terms of the sprinklers that are going to work or the irrigation system that's going to work, and how often and how long you would run that system for. Or potentially for a water-wise garden, if you're going to completely abandon your irrigation system because you're happy and you want to do the kind of work in time to water by hand, that's fine too. But you're going to need to either modify the irrigation system of the turf if you're going to have a front yard that, for example, switches to half turf, half water-wise landscape, or you might need to cap off part of it, but still make sure that the sprinklers can be changed so that the turf still gets evenly watered. So that's the one thing you're going to have to think through, but absolutely in phases is just fine. And many, many people do it that way. So quick question from Sharon, going back to the yarrow lawn that I showed. And she wanted to know if yarrow grows taller than carapia. Unmown, yarrow will definitely grow taller than carapia, which is another turf alternative that's being used these days in many different areas, California being one of them. However, you can keep either of them mown to any height. Yarrow, if you want to keep it like really, really short though, is probably not your best bet. Okay, from Tony, how can you find survey markers? I am not quite sure what you mean by survey markers, unless you mean like a layout kind of those little flags. I'm not sure. If you can type back into the Q&A, make sure that I understand what you mean by survey markers, and also where you are. I might be able to get back around to that question and help you. Okay. So with that, let's keep it moving along. So the stormwater retention feature for your landscape. A rain barrel is technically an option for the turf replacement rebate if you have gutters all around your house. However, I will tell you that rain barrels are normally not your best solution. It's one of the first things that people think about because it's a product that you can buy and they've been around for a while. However, if any of you have rain barrels, you will know that when it starts raining, they fill up almost instantly. And that 50 gallons of water, well, it seems like a big drum of water if it's right outside your door. In fact, even for a water-wise garden, will not water a whole garden even once. The only thing that most people who work with rain barrels, and I've talked to a lot of them, tell me that their barrels are good for is filling up a watering can and watering some potted plants around the patio. So if you are passionate about rain barrels, by all means, go ahead and do it. And some people get really into it and they link them together, or they invest in larger cisterns and they'll capture thousands of gallons of water. And if you want to, then go for it. But for most of us, it's a lot more functional, a lot less expensive, and a lot more environmentally beneficial to capture that water in the ground where our plants will get a deeper soak in a small rain. And again, we're going to be helping recharge the groundwater table in a larger storm event. Now, it's all going to be site specific. For some of you who are in other areas, if you have high water tables, which is normally in most areas of Southern California not an issue, you might have other issues. If you're on a very steep slope with clay soil, you might not have much room to capture water in the ground. So it's going to be up to you. But for most of us, here's what we want to be thinking about in general. The new approach to rainwater, when we think about how it falls on our property, is to slow it down, dissipate some of that velocity that is coming off of the roof or washing from our neighbor's driveway, let it spread out some, and that's going to allow our landscapes to sink that precious water in. And ideally, you will want to find a space in your yard to sink that precious rainwater that's at least 10 feet from your building foundations. A little bit can sink in here or there in most cases, but if you're going to be accumulating a lot of water and then let it soak in a concentrated area, try to get that, if possible, a little bit farther away from the house. And so this is, for example, my solution for my front yard, where I used to have pretty bad flooding problems because there's a little bit of a slope up from the street and water would wash down the driveway as well. And then it would sort of bottom out in front of the house and kind of get flooded. And we don't have roof gutters because the rafter eaves are curved and it's kind of a lot of work, major surgery to get them in. And so we just took all that water sheeting off of the roof pretty close to the house, put it in a narrow dry stream bed. Or if there was a big wide thing, it would just kind of travel uphill some. It wouldn't do that much. And then as soon as it got to the walk, we put that water in something called a French drain, because there's not much room for a whole naturalistic dry stream bed next to the walk. I didn't want someone to be rolling their ankle right where the water wants to naturally accumulate, because this is the low spot. And so that's French drain is just a trench that's then filled with a wide diameter gravel, and the water can move through this trench in between the open spaces in that gravel. And we let that go down the side, dug underneath the walkway, around the side, and then let that go all the way around to the back, where there's room for it to open up into a more naturalistic, more traditional kind of style dry stream bed. And so your solution might not be quite as involved. My partner and I are both horticulture professionals. This is the sort of stuff that we do. So we wanted to capture every single drop of water that fell on the property and have it soak into our garden. You might not be that into it, but any one of those individual features might be your solution. And it all can be relatively logical. You want to start with observation. Look at your yard. Think about, where does the water come from? Is it coming mostly from your roof? Is it coming from your driveway? I lived at a place where the neighbor's whole backyard was concrete and it was immediately upslope from the place I was renting. So it all washed into our yard every time it rained. What are you looking at? How much water is it? Is it just a kind of trickle out of one downspout from the roof gutters, or is it really something that's causing flooding problems right now that needs to be dealt with? How does it move through the property, and where does it end up? Are you going to need to change things? Are you going to need to dig trenches? Are you going to need to move a lot of soil around to get water to go somewhere different? Or sometimes I've worked with people where I had one backyard that I did a design for where there was already a natural low spot in the lawn where that's where all the water wanted to accumulate anyway. So as the lawn came out and we moved it more towards a water-wise and native garden, that area just got dug out slightly more, worked in some rock to kind of make it more of a feature. But the landscape was already kind of naturally flowing the water to the right place. So it might not require a lot of moving dirt around. And then if you are going to be digging down and moving dirt around, think about what you want to do with that dirt. You might just be able to feather it out and rake it out and make it go away. But I also would encourage you to think, do you want to make some interesting mounds places? Do you want to do some terracing? If you have heavier soil and you want to try to grow some plants that require better drainage, it's a good opportunity to make some mounds and get some planting areas that are going to have some better drainage. And so here is another example from the Theodore Payne Foundation Native Plant Garden Tour of a suburban house in Pasadena that I really like the water harvesting solution. Here is the downspout from the rain gutter. And again, remember we're talking about slowing, spreading, and sinking. And so here, to dissipate that velocity and slow things down some, it hits this piece of concrete. So it's not bringing soil down into this French drain, tips the water into this area. And it's a wider trench than the example in mine, but not quite enough space still to have a full-on dry stream bed or something naturalistic. I really like the use of the reused terracotta roofing tiles to kind of form a little bit of a retaining wall along the sides. And so water will travel in between the large diameter gravel here. Usually it's like 1.5 inches plus size gravel for a feature like this, and then mixing in some boulders and cobblestone. And then for large storm events, around to the front, where safely around the house, that water could spread out more. And should there be a really large storm and the water really needs to spread out, then safely around the house, it can spread out through this mulched, very rambunctious, and I think quite beautiful wild garden. And if it needs to, it can then safely move out to the street where the water would have gone anyways if these features had not been put in. And if this look is a little bit too wild for you or way too wild for you, all of this can be done even in a formal landscape. The water harvesting principles don't change at all. So here are some other examples. And notice how these can be very beautiful parts of the garden as well. And the rock can provide contrast to the plants. And if you don't want it to be rock, you don't need to be rock as well. Sometimes people will work with oftentimes native grasses. You want to do your research to make sure, but oftentimes native grasses that are low water can also take seasonal flooding. There's some other plants as well that are tolerant of it. And so if you want it to be more planted and less rocky for your look, that's fine too. And then one quick aesthetic note is I always encourage people to default to using the stone that is going to be most local to wherever you are. So here in Southern California, for most of us, that's going to be this whitish to grayish to kind of dark and speckled forms of mostly granite, sometimes called river rock and or arroyo stone. And there's a few reasons for that. One, it's the most local, so there's going to be the least environmental impact as opposed to buying some rock that came from another country or was trucked in across the country. Two, it's going to usually be cheaper. So around here, working with this style of stone usually costs about 1/3 as much as working with any other style of stone in the landscape. And then finally, and for aesthetics perhaps most important, is that oftentimes the local material is the one that you can really get in a range of different sizes when you're buying it from a landscape materials yard. And so that's going to allow you to combine different sizes and get a natural look. With a lot of the quote ornamental styles of gravel, you can only get it in one size. And that's just fine if you're doing a tiny little area of the garden or putting some ornamental stone on top of a potted plant soil or something like that. But once you scale it up to a landscape feature, you really need multiple sizes to make it look right. Here's another example of capturing the water coming down a large driveway, pointed straight at the garage. Oftentimes in these landscapes, there's a little bit of a dip that's supposed to kick the water sideways, but if it's old construction or if there was a lawn here growing thatch over the years, they don't function anymore. And so by putting this in, the water can safely go off to the side away from the structure. And if there's a lot of water, safely around to this new garden that's growing in. And so this is really just a kind of a teaser. If you're going to do this yourself, you're going to want to learn some more about how to put in and design for these features and decide which feature is right for you. And we have a whole class for that. We teach it once a year in a live format, which I just taught recently, but we have an online recording of the full workshop called Rainwater Harvesting for Home Landscapes. And so you can find that full workshop that goes way more into depth and gives you much more information to work with at cbwcd.org/YouTube, which will take you to our online workshop recording playlist, and that's Rainwater Harvesting for Home Landscapes. And so now we're going to start talking about choosing plants. And the reason why we're talking about choosing plants at this point in time is because that's about the time when you're going to want to start thinking about it. You're going to want to think about your goals first. And I encourage you to think about your water harvesting before you start choosing plants, because since you're going to be harvesting water where it's available, whether it's coming from a downspout, whether you're finding the right spot to take it off your driveway or from your roof, oftentimes you're relatively limited in the location and what the best solution is going to be for you to do that. The site of your landscape and the conditions kind of tell you what that solution wants to be. And so you kind of want to figure that out, because that's going to maybe section off different sections of your landscape or separate part of your yard from another part of your yard. Your goals are also going to have a big impact. If you need an outdoor dining area, if you're going to build a fire pit, something like that, figuring out where those might site is actually going to be helpful towards choosing your plants as well. Because just looking at, for example, a 1,000 square foot backyard is overwhelming for people if it's a completely blank slate. But if you have at least initial ideas, even if they change, about where a dry stream bed's going to be, where a patio is going to be, where a outdoor grill area is going to be, where an outdoor dining area is going to be, it's going to start to section off your landscape into smaller, more manageable chunks. And then you might think, well, okay, if I have a patio, I'm going to need some shade in the afternoon. And so you're going to put a small tree to the west of that patio so that you can cast some afternoon shade. And then once you know that you have a tree, maybe there's going to be room for like 2 small shrubs there. And you can start to figure out more of what you need rather than just looking at a completely blank slate. And we'll do a design example in just a little while where we kind of talk about that order of operations of setting things up. There's also a couple of, again, more in-depth workshops that I will mention in just a second, where you can really delve into those ideas deeper. And so as you start to think about plants, you're going to want to do some fun research. And if you are like most people, when you do your research, you are going to fall in love with a whole bunch of different plants. This is the point where most people need to remind themselves to keep it relatively simple. You don't want to put in too many individual plants and crowd them. And for most people, you don't want to put in too many different kinds of plants as well. The average homeowner, if you put 75 different types of plants, one each of this and that and this and that and this and that, because you think they're all cool plants, into your landscape, you're not going to be setting yourself up for success. That's a lot of plants to learn about. Even if the maintenance for most native and water-wise plants is relatively simple and only needs to happen once or twice a year, needing to learn what and when for each of those plants can be overwhelming. And then visually, with one of this and one of that and one of this and one of that, it's very hard to achieve a coherent look to your landscape. So for the average gardener who just wants a lovely water-wise garden, I'd normally recommend you're going to be looking at 12 to 15 different types of plants in the typical front or backyard, maybe up to about 20, occasionally more, but definitely not getting up into like 40 or 50 different species, unless a plant enthusiast is kind of who you are. And if it's your first garden, even if you're really excited about it, I'd still say keep it relatively limited, set yourself up for success. Over time, you can always make it more complex if you want. And the biggest part of setting yourself up for success when it comes to plants is to put the right plant in the right place. Right plant, right place. That is your mantra. You will hear that in probably most plant workshops that you would take. That is so critical. When I talk to people who say that they are not good at growing plants, they don't have a green thumb, I always ask those people this question. When you are buying a plant, or better, when you are thinking about buying a plant, do you do a little bit of research? Do you look up that plant online, and do you read what conditions it needs? And that means the sun and the sun or shade it wants, how big it's going to get, what sort of maintenance it needs, its water requirements, and whether or not it needs good drainage if your soil doesn't drain well. Universally, those people say they don't do any research, they just buy the plant and hope for the best. When I talk to people who are good at growing plants, they almost always do that research. There is no such thing as a green thumb. It is true that if you've been gardening for a long time, you tend to learn over time, but the biggest secret is to do a little bit of research. It's so easy these days with the resources available on the internet. And I'll tell you a little bit about what those different things mean. Sun or shade. Full sun doesn't have to be full blasting sun all day. That literally means 6 or more hours of direct sunlight to that area of the garden throughout most of the year. So for example, in my yard, I have some plants on the east side of my house. So they get afternoon shade from the house, but they're still considered full sun areas. Part shade in Southern California can either mean like high dappled shade from a tree overhead all day, or a little bit of direct sunlight, but generally only for a few hours. And then in shade, maybe from another taller plant or a structure for much of the rest of the day. Full shade means no direct sunlight in most cases. If a plant only requires full shade, especially in inland Southern California, even a few hours of direct sunlight in the summer can sort of fry it. Drainage and soil type. Figuring out your soil type, if you're interested in that, go for it. There's lots of videos on the internet that can help you figure that out. In some of our other workshops, we talk about it. But essentially, that mostly comes down to, does your soil drain well? If your soil doesn't drain well, it's usually either because you have a heavier clay type soil, or sometimes you have compaction. But if you do have compaction and it's in a larger area, then you can physically dig up in your garden. And if you're not going to kind of really redo everything and be able to hire a contractor to come in, with like a small backhoe and loosen everything, usually, essentially, you're just kind of working with plants that are adapted to slowly draining clay soil, whether or not it's actual clay soil or if it's just compacted. And there is a way to do a drainage test. It doesn't really cost anything. If you have a shovel, you just dig a 1-foot hole. Make sure all the soil around it's wet by filling it a couple of times, and then do it a final time and time it. And essentially, you want to find out how many, on average, inches of water drain through that hole once all the soil around it is wet afterwards. If it drains 2 inches per hour or more, you have well-drained soil. Between 1 and 2 inches, not great. Under 1 inch, pretty slowly draining soil, and that's just fine. Basically, if you have less than 1 inch per hour of drainage, or maybe even like 1.5 inches, you're going to want to work with plants adapted to clay soil. There are so many great plants adapted to clay soil, it might make choosing plants even a little bit easier. If you want to see kind of step-by-step what that looks like, how to take those measurements, at our online workshop playlist, again, that's cbwcd.org/YouTube. And I typed that into the chat at the very top of the chat. Check out our Choosing, Purchasing, and Planting Water-Wise in California Native Plants workshop. And either check out the whole thing, or about 12 minutes in, I show slides kind of step-by-step of how to do a drainage test and how to interpret those results. And then finally, size. Size is super important and something that people underestimate. Look up how big the plant is going to get and assume it will get that big. And some of our Mediterranean and California native plants, like our sages, or for Mediterranean, like our lavenders, will get full size within a couple of years, sometimes even first year. And in inland Southern California, oftentimes the plants will get even a little bit bigger than it might say in the online information. On the website I'm about to show you, the Inland Valley Garden Planner, I've tried to really base the size that we have there as much as possible on like my actual observations in the garden. I've kind of gone back and edited some of that information to go from more general to measurements that I've actually taken, having seen these plants get larger. But essentially, just assume if you are in inland Southern California, that plants will get in the larger range for your shrubs and perennial sized plantings. So you definitely don't want to pack those plants too close together. It makes both the health of the plant compromised, as well as it can make the maintenance much more complicated to keep things from not growing over each other. And so to help you with the actual plant choices, we have some resources for you. And what I'm going to show you first briefly is the Inland Valley Garden Planner website. This is a website that we created specifically for inland Southern California gardeners. However, it is used, and most of the information is very relevant to people all over California, as well as for some of the plants, the general kind of Southwest. And we do have profiles of common in our area, Mediterranean plants. And so we do find that people in the Mediterranean and Australia are using this website as well. And so there's a couple of main areas here. Kind of the heart of the website is the plant finder, where you can say, for example, I know I want a shrub, I want to be low water, it's going to be in full sun, and I want it to be good at attracting butterflies. And hey, I do have poorly draining clay soil. And so we have profiles on this website of what we consider to be kind of the top 350 plus plants for home gardeners in our general area. And so that's a lot to go through. We've already done a lot of work kind of narrowing it down to that much. There's some plants that I love that are not in that list, but we're trying to keep it relatively simple and everything that's relatively easy to grow for gardeners who aren't professional horticulturists. And so from that, you can use these search criteria. And for this, okay, we're down to 13, and you can look at pictures. You can get that basic right plant, right place information, exposure, so sunlight that it wants, the height and the width. And then for any of these, you can also get more information where each plant has a profile, where you can see the plants up close, far away, larger pictures, description of the plant properties. So that gives you the more detailed information, soil adaptations, some of the functions. This one has wildlife value, attracts butterflies, good on slopes, the water needs. And so you can get water schedules, and there's information that helps you understand what this means. We also have lots of other irrigation related workshops to really help you understand that part. But importantly, it helps you match plants with like irrigation needs, which will be critical to being able to functionally water your water-wise garden when it does need water. And then very importantly as well, most of these are low maintenance plants, but most home gardeners are going to want to do something usually about once a year to keep the plants looking good and their growth looking fresh and keep them as floriferous as possible. But it's really important to know what and when. Some plants, for example, only want a light trimming. Some plants want a really hard cutback once a year to reinvigorate their growth. Some plants want a hard cutback, but maybe you'll need to do it every 3 years. Oftentimes it syncs up with right before their main growth spurt for the year is going to be. So some plants that's going to be in the fall, some plants that's going to be in the spring, is usually either fall or spring for Southern California. But if you cut it back at the wrong time of year, you might cut off all of the flower buds that are forming and not have flowers for a whole of the year. So this kind of gives you the information that you need to be successful on the maintenance. Or if you are hiring a landscaper to do the work, unless they really specialize in this plant palette, there's a lot of good, hardworking landscapers out there that just aren't quite used to the maintenance needs for the water-wise palette yet. And so without a little bit of direction, they're just going to kind of randomly cut things back when they have time to keep them within the right size. And so you might need to be a little bit more involved in directing when different things happen, or if you have a landscaper who really wants to learn, providing them with this resource. And so I encourage you as well, use this to make your own sort of little custom maintenance list. And so when you choose your plants for your garden, you can either save with bookmarks, or better yet, I encourage people to make themselves a little either chart or a Word file or even a spreadsheet for people like spreadsheets, where you can have set up, here's what I need to do in the fall for my plants. Here's what I need to do in the spring for my plants to really keep everything thriving. And so that's the plant finder section. However, doing that and figuring out all the right plant, right place, and what plants are going to go together as well can be a little bit overwhelming for some people who just want a lovely functional garden. And so we have also created lots of garden design examples and templates along the 8 most common themes that we found that people in our area are interested in these days. So for example, one very popular one is having a native butterfly and songbird garden. So for each of these, you can explore designs where we tell you a little bit about the concept. And then we have renderings and plans of what that concept with this plant list would look like for multiple different sizes of gardens. And some of them have slightly different concepts as well, using the same plants. And for each of these different sizes, there are labeled and unlabeled versions, ones where you can get quick links that will go directly to the plant profiles to learn more. And then each of these sort of rendering styles for each of these sizes of yards matches up directly with a bird's eye view scaled planting plan. And so you can see, to get that kind of look, what plants we would use where, what combinations, and roughly how far apart we did them. And so you can, if you have a medium-sized yard, you can kind of match it up, or you can just take examples from different ones and go from there. You're welcome to use the designs just as we have it, or oftentimes people will use these designs and these plant lists as a base and then research some additional plants that they're going to mix into it. And so for each of these, you can also get the plant list with then the links to the plants. And we've tried to keep these very simple. Most of these are like 12 to 15 different plants in the palette, 1 to 3 small trees, some shrubs for different conditions. Some want full sun, some can take some shade, some smaller perennials, and maybe a grass. And you get a description, horticultural preferences, moisture needs. So after it's established, some irrigation schedules. And we have that for the multiple different styles. So that's the garden design section. And then we also have some helpful lists. So for example, if you want to just learn about some plants that are good for slopes, you can go there. Plants that are going to be good either right next to or even down in your dry stream bed, you can go to this one. You can also create your own login and save a profile. And we don't share your email information or anything with anybody else, but that will let you be able to save some lists. So if you want a list of ideas for your front yard, for your backyard, for your grandma's house, you can kind of save all of those and quickly get back to the plant lists you're considering, or different concepts for your landscape. And we are constantly working on adding more to this site. So sign up for our newsletter for any of those announcements. So for example, in the next couple of months, we're going to be cleaning some things up, making the list saving functions much more functional. And as well, I am almost done editing a in-depth series of 11 videos, really going into depth, teaching DIY landscape design and doing a much more in-depth example than, for example, we are going to do later today. So that's the Inland Valley Garden Planner website. I encourage you to check it out and make use of it. We built it for you. And so I'm going to relaunch the slideshow. And a couple of other things. For those of you in California, we also have an online workshop called Favorite Plants for Inland Valley Gardens, which are literally just all my favorite plants for home gardens that can take that inland valley heat. For those of you in coastal areas or a little bit further north, most of these plants are going to work very well for you, but they can really take the punishing kind of inland conditions. Some can take true desert conditions, some not quite, but I talk about all of that. And I present those plants in different categories. So thinking about how people are going to be designing their own landscape, we go through favorite trees, favorite plants that can really take that super hot, full blasting afternoon sun. What are the plants that are going to thrive in that funny little area on the north side of the house or the garage where it's shady for a lot of the year, but then full blasting sun when the sun is high overhead in the summer. We go through all of those different kind of conditions, and I give you my favorite choices. And then we also, for people in our local service area, have a no-cost residential design assistance program where you can actually sign up and work one-on-one with our experienced staff, and we will come up with a water-wise landscape design, which you can use for the design part of your rebate application if you want, for your front yard or your backyard. And we start by working with you to choose one of these 8 different concepts or themes. We always do then go from there just as a starting off point and then customize it. We almost always bring in additional plants for your garden to really have it be what's going to work well for you. And so that's available to water customers of Chino Hills, Cucamonga Valley Water District, Monte Vista Water District, Ontario, Fontana, or Upland. And we have to limit that because it is a lot of one-on-one staff time. So those are the people who live in the communities where our public funding base comes from. And so we'll do either a front yard or a backyard. It's a no-cost program, but to make sure that people are serious about putting in a landscape project, we do require a $100 fully refundable deposit. And then if you put a water-wise landscape that meets some basic requirements in the space, even if you make some changes to the design within a year, we hope to and are very happy to fully refund that deposit. And then we will work with you one-on-one to guide you in getting us measurements of your yard, photos of your site. We'll create a scaled base map, and then we will have an online screen sharing meeting over Zoom, and we will sit down and design your project. And so if you are interested and you are in one of these areas, you will see on the details page, if you get the details, that you are required to attend a workshop, but this is that workshop. So you've already done that part. You can get the full details at cbwcd.org/design assistance. That's cbwcd.org/design assistance. Or if you miss writing that down, you can either find it from our main website or just look up our phone number and give us a call. We'll be happy to help you out. So here's an example of a California native with a nice dry stream bed to capture water off the roof, front yard design that has now gone in and is getting established for a family in Chino Hills. And so from there, we're going to talk a little bit about what's next in the planning. We're going to talk about some costs. We'll talk about design, go through our example, and then we'll move on to talking about turf removal and irrigation. So you're going to want to think some about construction planning, especially if you've never done this before. Are you going to be able to build a project, whether you're doing it yourself or hiring a contractor, all at once, in phases, or a bit at a time when you find the time? If you can, in Southern California, or in California, or in most hot climates, plan to plant in the best season. Many people are surprised to find out that mid to late fall, so think Thanksgiving through shortly after New Year's, early winter as well, is the best season. The reason why is because it is in the fall getting cooler. Even if the peak temperatures during the day are still pretty hot, the days are less long and the temperatures are on a falling trend normally. And then the plants are going to have the winter season. Some will start growing right away. Many of them, you might not see a lot of growth up top, but the roots are going to be getting settled in, starting to get established. And so then when the spring hits the next year, they can really start growing. And then especially if we get an early heat wave, those plants that have started rooting in are going to be much, much more able to survive without getting stressed than if you planted, for example, in April, when the weather is amazing, but you might only be 5 or so weeks away from triple-digit temperatures, and those plants are just going to be barely getting established. I really try to get my plants in the ground for a big planting project by early spring at the latest. If you're working with a commercial landscaper, they're probably going to install any time of the year. However, some of them who are really good with native plants are going to kind of know what to do to get them established that time of year if you can't work with them to get them in the fall, which is ideal. And then some of them will also kind of guarantee the plants. And so if they're installing in the summer, for example, and you can ask about this, they might say, okay, if anything doesn't make it, they'll come back and they'll replace a little bit later in the year. And so those are all things to think about. Summer is a good time for contemplating design. It's the best time of year for killing turf, and we'll talk about why in just a moment. And it's a perfectly fine time for preparing your irrigation. So you can have that already, everything planned out, and then be ready to plant right as things are starting to cool off in late November, early December. That's the perfect kind of project schedule. If you still have turf right now, for most people, if you're going to be doing the work yourself, better to really do a good job planning and plant next fall, killing your turf this summer. than try to rush and get it all done. If you're working with a contractor who's going to knock the whole thing out, you might still have some time. Work with your budget and adjust your design and phasing as necessary. This can be done, especially if you're doing the work yourself or with family and friends with very little budget, or if you're doing ornate things and building structures and hardscapes and patios and custom outdoor kitchen, could cost an arm and a leg. But if you have that sort of disposable income, it might absolutely be worth it. Might really transform how you use your property. And if you're going to be working with a contractor, bring the contractors in early. Get multiple cost estimates and check references. And good contractors are busy. And now kind of more than ever with landscape, there's more and more people are spending time at home. So there's a lot of interest in landscape. And so a really good contractor might not be able to start right away. They could be months out. So bringing them in early is going to also help you not only understand your costs, deal with your budgeting, get multiple quotes, check references, but it'll also let you get on that contractor's schedule. Hiring a landscape contractor is not just hiring a guy with a truck who gives you the lowest price. It is a skill set, especially once you get into irrigation and the water capture part of it. And the lowest quote you get is not always going to be the best one. California contractor law requires that any landscape project, like any other contractor, where materials and labor adds up to more than $500, should be done by a licensed contractor. And that does a few things. A licensed contractor with a current license is also required to carry insurance. So if someone gets injured on the job, that's going to be handled by them. And you, in the vast majority of cases, will be well protected. If you're just hiring a guy with a truck, you are less guaranteed. A licensed contractor is not necessarily awesome at their job, which is why you always want to check references. But they do have a contractor's license to lose if they walk out on the job or if they do a bad job. And so that protects you a little bit as well. But even if they are a licensed contractor, you can ask for their contractor's number, and then you can look them up on California has the Contractors Licensing Board website. It's easy to find if you just Google California Contractors Licensing Board, and then you can easily find, look up my contractor, put their number in, make sure everything matches up and it's in good standing. And then also for your contractor, you're going to want to make sure that they have a history of doing the types of projects that you want. Ask them for multiple references of similar projects, and then call those people. And when you talk to those people, ask, are they happy with the final result? But also ask, did the contractor show up when they were expected? Did the costs all end up where they were supposed to? All that sort of stuff. A good contractor can go so far to improving your project, making it really have an amazing outcome. But a contractor who is not the best one for you, if you haven't checked your references, can also cause plenty of headaches. And so here's what we've been seeing lately in our area for turf removal plus landscape installation costs. If you are doing the work yourself, talking about removal, planting, irrigation, mulching, just really buying supplies, you can often do it within a $3 per square foot budget, as long as you're not building patios or anything, really extravagant. And so that lines up pretty well with where a lot of the water agencies are in terms of the turf replacement rebate, and you might be able to cover your costs. If you are hiring a contractor, you will almost assuredly not be able to pay for the whole project within the scope of a turf replacement rebate. What we are seeing for contractors are removal of plants, adapting existing turf irrigation to a system that's going to work with the new plants, doing something like mulching and a modest water capture feature. We are seeing $7 to $9 plus per square feet for companies that specialize in it and really have a good reputation, and then are paying the staff with that experience, maybe a bit more. For all of the above, plus some maybe demolition of existing paths, new paths going in that might have either flagstone or some pavers or decomposed granite, gravel paths, more than just kind of plants and mulch, maybe some boulders, a little bit of landscape lighting. We're seeing $12 per square foot and up is kind of what we've been seeing. Now, it's all based on many factors, so your cost won't necessarily match these, especially front yard, backyard, access, the size of the plants that are going in. Things are going to be different. So you always want to get multiple quotes. And also, when you are getting quotes from the landscaper, tell them you are going to be comparing multiple quotes. And so ask them to write up their quote with as much detail as possible so you can actively compare what you are getting and you can really have down exactly what you are expecting. Because if you provide someone even with a printed out design, they might be working with different assumptions for the irrigation system, for the size of the plants they're going to plant, for other things as well, how many ornamental boulders they're going to put in. And you can always, after you get the quote, if you want more information or if you have additional questions, get back in touch with them. They should be happy to answer them because that's going to be work for them. And so with that, let's keep it going. So here we're going to bring everything that we've talked about so far together in a design example. And so just a note, I mentioned earlier that I'm almost done with that step-by-step video series, kind of walking you through how to use that Inland Valley Garden Planner, step-by-step, do your own design, or you can use just the design principles if you're going to be using different plants because you're in a different region. And so the best way to stay in the loop and know when we've launched those videos is to sign up for our newsletter at cbwcd.org/newsletter. So then you'll definitely hear about when it gets posted. And so this is our design example of my wedge-shaped front yard here in Pomona, California. This is where I live. And so first thing you're going to want to do is take some measurements of your yard if you are up for drawing out your yard to scale on graph paper. Now, some people are not going to be into this. Some people are going to want to work more intuitively. And if that's you, if you are just not going to be up for drawing it out on graph paper, that's just fine. That doesn't mean you can't be good at putting in a landscape design. I know some great horticulturists who work on small scale, but certainly front yard kind of projects where they're not as much into that. They work more intuitively. That's just fine. You're going to be less likely to be able to get your exact plant counts ahead of time. You might need to do more kind of pushing and pulling around of things when you're doing your layout on your site, but that's just fine. If you are not going to be doing this, I encourage you, rather than just kind of completely guessing, one thing that sometimes I recommend, and sometimes I do as well for projects where I'm not going to be surveying lots of existing plants and I'm just figuring out a few things here and there, is you can go to your local landscape supply store and you can buy, normally they're used for irrigation system layout. You can buy bundles of little cheap flags where you can get it's a bundle of 100 little flags. They're basically on a wire. And there's a little flag part of it. That's just a few inches by a few inches, different colors, color doesn't matter. And those packs of 100 cost a little more than $10. And so you can get those and you can write on those with a Sharpie. So you can write out the names of the plants you're thinking about and you can stick them around in your garden and take measurements and kind of figure things out that way. That's one approach if you are just not going to be doing the measurements. But I encourage you to get out, measure your site. So how I normally start is I will, on Google Maps, or better, you can download a free program called Google Earth, which lets you zoom in and gives you better print options. Zoom in on the aerial photo. So this is my front yard. So you can see on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper how close I was able to get. And that's enough to then be a base for basic measurements. You won't be able to normally see underneath the eaves of your house. If you have big trees, you won't be able to see underneath them, but it gives you enough reference points that you can do a rough drawing and take all of your measurements. And then depending on how far you want to go with it, some people will be worth it to do all the little measurements under the eaves, and some people will focus more on the main area, whatever's going to work for you. Most people have generally rectangular shaped yards, much easier, but I do walk you through, and one of the reasons why I want to use this as the example in the videos that will be out soon about how to take measurements for kind of strange shaped yards like this and still get all the angles correctly. And so with that, you're going to want to then draw it out on a piece of graph paper. For the average suburban yard, I recommend getting a hold of an 11 by 17 pad of graph paper. You can usually get that at an art supply store, definitely easy to order online. That larger size just gives you a significantly better amount of room to work with than a typical 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. On typical graph paper, the squares are going to be 1/4 of an inch. So in smaller yards, you can have each square or each 1/4 of an inch be 1 foot. In larger yards, you're going to want to have each square or each 1/4 of an inch be 2 feet is generally how it'll work out. And it can take some trial and error to get that going. So kind of figure out your largest measurements and you can see what'll work for you. My front yard is this weird wedge shape, and it adds up to about 1,200 square feet of landscape area. And I was able to just barely make that fit on an 11 by 17 sheet where each square was going to be 1 foot. If you know you are going to be working with a larger yard, you can, I usually don't see them around me in the local art supply stores, but you can order them online. The 1/4 inch graph paper is sometimes called 4 by 4 graph paper because each inch has 4 squares by 4 squares. You can get 8 by 8 graph paper that has smaller squares. And so if you know you're going to be doing a larger yard and you want that easier reference, you can get that as well. So hopefully that all makes sense. And again, in those videos coming out, we go into it way more. But either way, decide on what scale is going to work for you. And then that's going to make things quite a bit easier to draw things out and really get your plant locations and plant counts figured out. And then you want to have your list of goals. You might have already thought about them. If not, now is the time. And your goals might change as you get to your design. But the nice thing about drawing this out is that it gives you time to really think through all of that. And so I encourage you, put your goals down on a piece of paper, literally write them out, even if they seem obvious to you, and keep them nearby so you can constantly refer back to them as you start getting excited about plants. Remember that you want to match those plants or your spaces, your patio spaces up with your goals. Remind you things as I start thinking about, for example, trees and getting excited that I want to keep my mountain view. So these are my goals for my front yard. My partner and I wanted the front yard to be beautiful, nice place to drive up to, look nice for the neighbors. We wanted the habitat value for local birds, butterflies, and pollinators. We wanted everything to be low water. Because this is really is a medium-sized front yard, but because of the angles on the cul-de-sac and how many houses there are that face each other, it really felt when it was all lawn like a little bit of a smaller yard than it really is. And the windows of these houses that face forward, and all of these houses have kind of living room areas that face forward, really just feels like you're kind of in a fishbowl with like 4 houses, feels like you're looking at you no matter what room you're in. So we wanted to have the landscape increase the sense of privacy and shelter. We wanted it to reflect the beauty of California, working with California native plants. We wanted to have blooms throughout as much of the year as possible. We wanted it to smell great. There are so many great smelling native plants where those smells just hang in the air, whether it's in the rain or on a hot summer day. Definitely want to integrate some of those. And we happen, because we face north and the San Gabriel Valley Mountains, or the San Gabriel Mountains are not too far to the north, have a great mountain view. And so as we put trees in for habitat value and beauty and to increase our sense of privacy, we wanted to carefully make sure that we actually frame and maintain bits of that mountain view. And so that list of goals. And so again, just like our other example, we can't do all of that with design, but if we just hit the nursery, even if we buy awesome plants, chances are we won't beat all of those goals. From there, we move into site assessment. And so for your site assessment, really that's just a fancy way of saying, take a look at things, observe for as long as it takes. And you're going to want to look at what areas are part sun and shade. We talked about soil and drainage. If you find spots of bad drainage, you're going to want to mark that out. You don't need to do 1,000 different soil tests, but 3 different spots in your yard is normally pretty good. Think about your views, whether that's the views out that you want to maintain, or if there's views onto your property that you want to block to provide some privacy. Where water flows, to capture that water or where water is going to flow through the property. Thinking about microclimates, those are any particularly hot or cold areas. And so where I am, hot microclimates are something we need to think about. So areas of full blasting sun that maybe get extra reflected heat off of a driveway or off of a stucco wall, those might be areas where it's going to be even hotter in the summer, and we might want to work with desert plants that can really take that heat and just turn it into more flowers, and they're not going to be upset by it. Thinking about noise and other neighbor issues, do you need some sort of recirculating water feature to kind of quiet things down? And thinking about existing plants, whether that's patches where there's really bad seasonal weeds that you know you're going to have to do some extra work on, or whether it is for existing plants. Like, for example, if your front yard has a really beautiful established magnolia tree, which is never going to be a low water plant. Maybe working with drip irrigation, you're going to maintain a medium water use zone around that. And then the rest of your yard can transition to lower water plantings. And so with that, you are going to literally draw out on your base map everything that is relevant related to that site assessment. And so what I do is, after I have a good clean base map on the graph paper, I immediately both scan, take a picture of with my phone, and photocopy that, because I never want to have to measure and draw out that base map again. And then either on copies or working with layers of tracing paper, you can start to put your base map and your observations and your design together. And so this was the relevant observations for this front yard. Just intuitively putting the things down that are going to matter. I wrote mountain view here because although I'm going to put some trees in, that just reminds me, if I'm working on my design on top of this, to not forget to maintain that mountain view. Here's the area that feels too open. Here's the area along the driveway with the hot western sun. That's a really particularly hot microclimate. Here's the area, because this faces north, where there's seasonal shade a lot of the year. Although in the middle of summer, the sun is high and it's full blasting sun. So I'm going to need to make sure I have plants that can take either part shade or full sun so they can make that transition. Where water flows, as I mentioned earlier, water comes off the roof, came down the driveway, this area flattens out, and this whole area would sort of get flooded. Sometimes we'd have like an inch of standing water here during rain, and we'd have to trudge through that to get out to the car. So we want to do something with that, turn that into a resource. And then also it's good to know where your utility lines are, whether those are the utility lines on the parts that are owned by the utility if they go through your property, or if you do happen to know where like your water main line runs. So for example, if it's installed very well, it might not be that much of an issue, but in doing some plumbing work before I moved into my house, I found out that in this yard, the water main line, so normally that goes directly between the meter and where you'll see water kind of come up and then stub into your house on the outside of the house, was replaced at some point and is only 6 inches deep. So that's important for me, because if I'm thinking about digging a dry stream bed or something like that here, I can't have that line exposed, and I also don't want to break it as I'm digging. So I marked that down. I found out where the gas line was on my property that was properly deep. I wouldn't want to put a huge tree right on top of it, but good to know. And then if I am going to dig, just know that it's there. And before you do any digging, and I'm not talking about just planting a couple of 1 gallon plants, but especially if you're going to be doing a dry stream bed, making anything significant, digging holes for large plants, you want to call Dig Alert in at least Southern California, which is free service. You can get registered and signed up by calling 811. Most other local areas have a similar service, where Southern California, if you call within 72 hours, someone will come out and they will mark any of the utility-owned lines that run through your project area. Very important. 1, you are legally supposed to do so. 2, especially in newer construction, there are things like fiber optic lines that run through properties. So for example, I know someone whose neighbor put in a new hedge, and the landscapers took out the internet to the whole neighborhood by breaking a fiber optic line when they were planting that hedge, because they didn't take the time to find out where that ran. So very important. And so that is your site assessment. not rocket science, but it's important to have that down. So when you start thinking about your design, it's a very logical process. If you want to bring artistry and creativity to it, you can. But even if you're someone who feels like you don't have an artistic bone in your body, you can absolutely, through a very logical process, come up with a beautiful and even very artistic looking landscape. And so with that base plan down, I'm working with just some masking tape and a matching 11 by 17 pad of tracing paper that I got at the same time, and starting to think out, okay, I'm going to have a couple of small trees that will provide a little bit of that privacy, meet my goals, but they're going to be small trees and lined up to where I can still maintain my best mountain view here. To provide privacy on this side, the house, as it looked out to this neighbor's driveway, it's just a gravel strip and the car's there. And so on this section, I didn't want to fully have a hedge all the way around and turn my back to the neighborhood. But for this section, I really didn't want to look at my neighbor's driveway with this angle. And so it would be a dense hedge that would block the view, kind of standing here, block the eye's view, and then provide a nice green backdrop to the landscape instead of my neighbor's truck being the backdrop to the landscape. And so notice it's not even choosing plants yet, but it's just figuring out what features are going to work really well. Figured out that I'm going to have that French drain and dry stream bed like I talked about when we were talking about the water capture parts. And then starting to figure out, are you going to have a pathway that winds through? For example, thinking about, I know I want a bird bath somewhere for the habitat. And if I put it here, my cats will be able to see it from both windows that they like to hang out in, as well as me when I'm in those rooms. And that will kind of nicely frame the view when you're walking out of the house as well. Nice feature. And then as you start to develop that, then you can start to choose your individual plants as you go, working with a pencil and an eraser, multiple layers of scratch paper. You might get multiple different ideas. So it's nice to be able to peel the paper or the tracing paper off and on, retrace a certain section that you like, and then work on a different idea and kind of going in from there. It doesn't need to be super clean. Usually when I do my first version of it, it's quite sloppy. And then after you do your erasing and you settle on a design that you like and the plants that you like, then if you want to, you could retrace it. And if you want to, you can do some colored pencils. And again, the idea, if you are really artistic and you want a really artistic version of it, good for you. But for me, even when I'm starting to color it, it's not really so that it's a piece of art. To me, the finished garden will be the thing that's beautiful, but it's just so it's a little bit easier to look at. And if I choose a different color for each plant, then I can kind of see how it repeats throughout the landscape and make it very functional. And so that is kind of, in general, the process. We have much more garden design information that we have created for you. There are 2 online workshops. If you're interested in California native plants, I really encourage you to check out our California Native Garden Design online workshop. And I will be teaching that live on Zoom coming up a little bit later in the early spring as well, if you want to sign up for that. And we also have a do-it-yourself landscape design online workshop, which is more general. And we also talk about kind of more features like figuring out for backyard social spaces, how to site your different areas for different things. And then these are just some screenshots from the full tutorial video series that will be coming up soon. So sign up for our newsletter. And so here you can see for my final plan of what I actually installed, I made a few different changes. We had a meadowy area of yarrow that we could walk through that will go up to our bird bath area. And really kind of this landscape aligns a lot with our bird and butterfly template with some influences and some plants mixed in from our woodland garden template. It's kind of my favorite plants from both of those, plus a couple of other things. And so just so you can see how that all came together, here's the house when we moved in. Here is it when we were getting started in January. And you'll notice that March, so not the perfect planting season, but we just were not going to wait a whole other year. We weren't going to be the people who moved into the neighborhood and had our landscape look like this for a year. But I wasn't going to water a lawn either. So sometimes you do what you're going to do. We did know our weeds and our grasses really well. And this is just a little bit of an annual seeded grass, which we knew that our turf removal technique of sheet mulching was going to work very well for. And so here it is in March planting. Here's the trench for our French drain. Here it is after the plants went in. And again, here's the time. Think, oh my God, it looks like nothing. This little one surrounded by the rocks, that's one of our trees. I plant everything from 1 gallon plants and the yarrow. I plant from 4-inch. Bringing in our wood chip mulch, and you won't need a pile this big for the front yard. This was also for our huge backyard. And then working with recycled corrugated cardboard boxes to be a temporary weed barrier. I never use that black plastic stuff. This is going to help smother the weeds for 6 months to a year, depending on soil moisture levels. And then by the time most of the weeds have sort of given up the ghost, it's just going to biodegrade and turn into compost, and there will be nothing left. Approximately 2 months, getting a few flowers, but you can still see a lot of space in between. Working, getting in our French drain, and just starting over time to work with some larger size rocks to make it look a little bit more natural, move some logs for some habitat and visual interest into the area. And then in August of that year, about 5 months in, I kind of had the screen open on a hot day and realized, hey, it's actually a garden now. I don't just see mulch, I see mostly green. Because all the plants are pretty small still, you couldn't see the design really yet, but it was starting to grow in. Still some mulch on the outer area where we have larger plants and trees growing in, but starting to get great pops of color. We got the yard certified as a wildlife habitat, which is something you can do through the National Wildlife Federation. You make a small donation to them, you get the cool sign. This is the first this type of garden in my neighborhood. So the sign kind of lets people know what's going on. It's kind of more rugged kind of beauty. And if you build it, they will come. So here's just one example. In that first year, hummingbird moved in, and I saw this same little girl hummingbird sitting on this same dried grass stalk every single morning, hunting for little insects and bogarting the hummingbird feeder. And so this is the young garden on trash day. So much more visual interest than things were when it was just a lawn. And no matter whether or not you know exactly what you're doing or not, or are always learning, I'm always learning. No matter how much experience you have, if you plant a whole garden, you're always going to lose a few plants. It's just what happens. So don't worry about it, and just ask yourself, was that right plant, right place? Do you want to try one more time with the same plant, or use that as an opportunity to plant something else? Learning, everything is a learning experience. Garden will never be perfect, but it can be interesting and engaging, and you adapt and you go from there. So here it is at about 6 months. So starting to have some nice pops of color and contrast of the plants, especially the faster growing ones. At about 13 months, I had another pile of mulch delivered for the backyard, so stood on top of it to take this picture. And so the small trees are still growing in. This is Toyon and Western Redbud. These are both large shrubs that can be pruned up to small trees. But you can see the smaller perennial color, and the yarrow is really pretty much grown in. So lovely. This area gets backlit by the morning sun. And so some of the plants with little bits of fuzz, which is one of the drought adaptations of many California native plants, just glow. Lots of beauty. And so at 13 months, here it is that spring with a cascade of different spring blooming perennials, which then turn into the summer blooming shrubs and perennials. So color and flowers and habitat value throughout much of the year. And that's just one example. So I like obviously a very wild, naturalistic aesthetic, and your aesthetic might be different, but the design process is going to be similar either way. But first, you need to get the lawn out if you have it. So now we're going to transition in the last half an hour to focus on turf removal methods and a little bit about irrigation before we wrap up. Let's check in and see if we have any questions. From Mark, what plants did I use from my hedge? My hedge is a combination of two of my favorite great habitat, but also solidly evergreen, really nice looking background plants. which are California coffee berry and holly leaf cherry. I planted them between 4.5 and 5 feet apart, which they will definitely, without any pruning, get quite a bit larger than that. But with pruning just a couple of times a year on the outer edges of it, are going to grow into be 8 to 10 feet tall, maybe a little bit taller with the cherry, but I can easily trim it to keep it within bounds. Am I layering the tracing paper when drawing? Sometimes. It just depends on what I want. Like normally when I start doing the design, especially, I will have the tracing paper layered over the site assessment. But then sometimes at a certain point, when I really know that the design responds to the site assessment and I'm just working on final details, then I'll sometimes slide that out. Sometimes I will slide over another piece of tracing paper and then trace over plants that I know that I like and then work on a separate iteration. But the thing I like about tracing paper is everything can be layered and unlayered as necessary, and you can always bring something back in. Okay, is the French drain lined with some type of landscape fabric in addition to the rock, or is it just filled with rock? Great question. People do it both ways. Some people use a filter fabric and then just like the top layer of the rock would then be on top of the filter fabric. But what I have learned from someone who works for a city and they do inspections and kind of maintenance reports on some of the large kind of commercial scale features, which are just scaled up versions of these, is that the filter fabric has gone sort of out of style because the more of these things that have gone in and kind of lifetime assessments of them, they find out that the filter fabric tends to clog, and is once it gets clogged with little silts and things like that, is really, really hard to get unclogged. And actually the lifetime of things performs a little bit better by just not having any filter fabric at all, and things do pretty well. And if over time your gravel does get a little clogged up, which is going to depend on your situation, it would be easier to kind of dig it back out and clean things up where you need to without the filter fabric than if it was in. And also that filter fabric at the end of its lifetime is just plastic trash. And so skipping it kind of reduces the environmental impact of your landscape as well. Okay, moving on. First, you need to get the lawn out if you have a lawn. And for those of you who maybe don't have a lawn, but you have a lot of weeds, these methods will work as well. If you are going to take this on yourself as an actual project, we have a full 3-hour workshop that just goes through these techniques one by one, as well as other context, and really gets way more into tips and tricks for each of these techniques than I have time to cover tonight. So you definitely want to check out our Removing Your Lawn the Right Way online workshop on our YouTube page. And if you already know from what we're about to talk about what technique you want, you don't necessarily need to watch the whole thing. You can just kind of click ahead and get to that. But first, what you want to do is identify your turf type and any primary weeds that you have. And again, on the full workshop, we spend more time on this, but the broad strokes are, you want to know if you have cool season or warm season turf. Cool season turf is green and growing all year long. Usually in Southern California, it's going to be something like a tall fescue or a tall fescue blend. There are different trade names for different, and marathon, just for one example, is a really common one. And you can see here, it's the most common if a lawn is intentionally planted or renovated. It's the most common thing that goes in. And the reason why is because it's a dark, deep green. It is evenly green all year long with enough fertilizer and water. And it has a nice kind of broad leaf if this is the look you are going for. If that is all of what you have, the good news is that this is the thing that really, really most wants to not live in a hot, dry climate. And so you pretty much can turn off the water for a couple months in summer. And if you turn it back on to see what's still alive, it will be mostly dead. However, no matter what the dominant part of your lawn is, or if you did install all tall fescue sod a number of years ago. What most of us have, at least in a patchy way, in our lawns is some amount of Bermuda grass. And so if you have a cool season turf area, but every year when it's cold, this time of year, there's brown spots in it, even if there's plenty of water and plenty of fertilizer. And when you look at those brown spots, it's kind of a more narrow, kind of more stringy kind of grass. Those are spots of Bermuda grass. And the reason why Bermuda grass is pretty much everywhere, no matter what type of lawn you started with, is because Bermuda grass spreads really easily, including from seed. And if you have a lawn service or a landscaper that's mowing lawns in neighborhoods all around, as that equipment goes from lawn to lawn, that's picking up all of the seeds and mixing everything in everywhere. And so this is an example of a lawn that was planted to be a Bermuda grass lawn. And that will kind of all go a dormant color in the coldest part of the winter, potentially. For example, I have a neighbor who has an all Bermuda grass lawn, and a lot of it's still green right now because we still get enough heat in Southern California, but parts of it have gone brown. And so it just depends. But you can see what it looks like. Even if it's green, you can see that it's kind of more stringy. There's kind of more nodes. And sometimes it is intentionally planted because it is super, super tough. If it is underwatered, it'll just sort of turn brown, but once water comes back, it'll green back up. It is an absolute survivor. It's super deep rooted. And so maybe kind of desirable for a lawn, but when we want a lawn to go away, it wants to keep coming back. And the funny thing about a lawn in a hot, dry climate is that when you want it to be beautiful and green and even, it seems like it wants to die. But once you want it to go ahead and die, it seems like it keeps coming back. And so to identify Bermuda, here are some notes. If it's, especially in summer, not mown for a couple of weeks, it starts to develop its seeds very quickly. And it has these kind of starburst shaped seed heads. It's very characteristic. It creeps along the soil surface and reroots. And one of the reasons why it's so hard to get rid of is because not only can it be very deeply rooted, sometimes up to a foot or more, and it can root underneath concrete or sidewalks or driveways and then keep creeping back into the landscape, but it can also reproduce from seed heads, from stolons, which are stems that go along the ground and reroot, or from rhizomes, which are roots that crawl underground and reroot. And so you never want to try to remove Bermuda grass by going over it with a rototiller, because you'll just be chopping it and repropagating it into hundreds or thousands of little plants. We'll talk about what techniques are best for it. There are some other sorts of warm season turf, but Bermuda grass is the really common one. And again, in the full workshop, we go through one by one of the other semi-common ones. And if you have this weed, this is really the one to be on the lookout for that might change your plans. You will have some extra work. This is yellow nutsedge. As you can see on the upper left image, if you have a lawn, you might not even realize it's there, because when everything gets mowed, it's just sort of a little bit yellower color. The leaf is a little glossier. But once the turf comes out, these things are also survivors, and you might start to see something that looks like this. If you see that coming up, you can smother it with some extra sheet mulch, which is the technique I'm about to show, or just pull it up as soon as it comes up. You never want to let it turn into this flower, which is kind of beautiful, looks like a little papyrus, but these things will spread all over the place. And one of the reasons why they're hard to get rid of is because they're called nutsedge, because they develop these little nuts along their roots. And when you pull the main plant out, it usually leaves these nuts in the soil. It's adaptation. They're not very well attached. And so it just drops them in the soil where it pulls out from, and then they could resprout. And so as your water-wise landscape transitions, as plants get established, from most water-wise gardens right after they're planted, that first year, they're still going to want to deep watering once a week and then tapering it off. And as it tapers off, this nutsedge tends to be less of a problem, but it can be very aggressive, and you just want to pull it out as it goes. And so methods for actually removing the turf. My go-to method is called sheet mulching, like you saw on the example in my front yard. This is basically smothering anything, weeds or turf, with a temporary biodegradable weed barrier made up of scavenged cardboard. Matte brown or white cardboard, nothing glossy, nothing those like glossy full color cardboards that sometimes like printers or computers or TVs might come in. You don't want to use those. Those won't work very well, but the matte cardboard works great. Where do you get that much cardboard? In this example of a place that I lived when I was in grad school, the owner of the house had a company that installed solar panels. So those boxes were perfect. The larger the boxes, so you have fewer seams to overlap, which could be the weak points for grass or weeds to sneak through, the better. So local small solar installation companies are great. Bike shops are great. I know a number of people who have worked with bike shops. They tend to be environmentally inclined. They were happy to put their boxes aside. Bikes come in large boxes. Auto body shops get bumpers and things like that in huge boxes, and they usually need to pay to get their dumpsters picked up. So that could work. Anywhere you could think of, independent appliance delivery places, things like that. Or sometimes people just have access to lots and lots and lots of small boxes. I did a design for a couple where one of them worked at Starbucks. And so she had access to smaller boxes, but could get enough in a week to do her whole front yard. So whatever's going to work for you. But the larger tends to be the easier. And here's the process. If you have a small enough yard, it is never a bad idea to do a kind of a grubbing out, a rough ripping out of as much grass as you can. If you have Bermuda grass, especially, if you have a larger yard, that might not be practical. And so you do what you can. You can use this as a primary way to smother out the grass if you need to. If you are doing this primarily to kill your turf, where you're just leaving the turf, you're not doing anything to remove it, and this is how you are killing it, smothering it in place, that's just fine. If that's the case, you're going to want to put down your sheet mulch, cover it with your wood chip or gravel mulch or whatever you're going to do, and leave it for 8 weeks at least before you do your planting. If you are digging up most of the grass and using this basically as the weed barrier to prevent it from regrowing, then you can plant right away. And either way, you're still going to want to keep an eye out, because inevitably, especially if you have Bermuda grass, a little is going to creep through. Just pull it out right away and stay on top of it, and it will be less and less and less. And that's the case for every single turf removal technique. That's just the reality. And so if you are going to be doing the sheet mulching, key thing is you want to water everything really, really well ahead of time. You want the soil to be moist. And then when the cardboard goes down, it's going to help trap in that moisture. If it's bone dry, you're going to kind of trap in that dryness, and it's going to be harder to get things really well soaked in. Any irrigation work that would need to be underneath the cardboard obviously should happen beforehand. You're never going to want to have to get back down underneath that cardboard until it's fully decomposed. And so after you water really well, you're going to want to wait either a couple of days if you have a well draining soil, up to maybe 5-ish days if you have heavy clay soil that stays muddy for a while, so you can work on the surface and it's not muddy. Then you're going to put down your cardboard overlapping. If minimum overlap, I consider to be like 6 inches. If you have Bermuda grass, 9 inches is even better, because it has some ability to try to grow back up and kind of wiggle through. And where your mulch, and this is for any technique or when you're doing kind of your finished landscaping, your mulching meets either the sidewalk or the walkway, you're going to want to dig out a little bit. So it's maybe an inch lower than the, in this case, brick next to it. So when the mulch layer goes on top, it's going to conform nicely to meet the level of the brick. And so once you go into the landscape a little bit, it can be taller. You don't need to cut down the soil a lot, but you don't want the mulch to be kind of way above at the edge and kind of always falling onto the walkway and kind of looking sloppy, being a tripping hazard, something like that. And so laying down the cardboard, here you can see we had a pathway that was going to go in as part of the design, and then the perimeter planting area. And so you can see here, the cardboard boxes are kind of stiff. And so part of it is, as you're going and laying the cardboard down, before you put down your mulch on top of it, you want to wet the cardboard down really well. And sometimes that's holding a hose to it and then seeing how much it can absorb, waiting a few minutes, putting down more until it slumps down to the landscape. And then you put your wood chips or your gravel on top of it. And here you go. If you are doing a small area, if you have an area, especially that's mostly just kind of various weeds and not Bermuda grass, or if you are generally digging things out and are just using this to prevent weed growth, it is an option if you're not wanting to scavenge the cardboard to use paper rolls that you can get at the hardware store in the paint section. The cost can add up quite quickly, and it's not as effective as cardboard. In addition, it's not necessarily like a recycling or repurposing. It is a new product that you're putting down into the soil. But the most important thing, if you're going to use it, is always get the plain brown, never the red color. The red color has a rosin kind of waterproof layer, which is great if you're trying to prevent spilling paint on your floor when you're doing a construction or painting project, but not good in your landscape. The cost can add up surprisingly quickly. I generally will do at least 2, if not 3 layers if I'm going to use it. So it's not my go-to, but I have used it here and there, especially in just generally weedy areas, and it works fine. I never recommend the plastic woven weed barriers, the black usually stuff. Sometimes it's tan from the hardware landscape store that looks like this, for a few reasons. Although they say that there's little micro perforations that are going to allow air and water through to the roots, and that's true right when you put it down, over time, either in gravel as silts build up, or especially if it's underneath a wood chip mulch as it breaks down, those clog up. And then those are not only depriving the roots of air and water, but there's going to be weeds that start growing on top of it as well. So you're still weeding. Usually after 5 years or so, it starts to break down, and then you're pulling out little chunks of plastic, and there's degrading microplastics in your garden. It's just a mess over time. It just simply doesn't work well long-term and creates a lot of plastic waste. So I just can't recommend that. Just kind of clearing that up. Your second turf removal option is solarization. This only works in kind of hot inland areas, so it won't work if you're on the coast because you need a lot of sun, and it only works in the hot summer months. And basically what you're doing is you're using clear plastic, not black, has to be clear, to build up enough heat in the soil that you are steam sterilizing the top 4 inches or so of soil, just killing everything in it. Roots, weed seeds, soil organisms. Turns out that it's been highly studied because this is used for organic agriculture as well. Usually the earthworms travel lower down, and the good soil microorganisms are much faster to return than any bad soil microorganisms. So it's not seen as being that disruptive to the processes going on in the soil, but it's just going to absolutely sterilize the first number of inches. Again, because Bermuda grass can be deep rooted, some can come back. There's no silver bullet, but it is pretty effective if laid out for at least 8 weeks in the peak of summer in full sun. So like how you see over here, where it's kind of shady underneath this tree, that's probably not going to be effective. Also, if I wasn't doing it in my own yard and I wanted, for example, this shrub to live, I probably wouldn't put the plastic this close because this shrub definitely has roots out in this area, and those will fry as well. So I might combine maybe sheet mulching close to the shrub and underneath the tree with, in the wider areas, the solarization. It does require some good soil moisture to get that ambient temperature in the soil up. So same thing, you want to water really well. Then you're going to want to lay out your clear plastic sheeting and make sure it's tight down to the soil, whether that's using bricks, old nursery containers that can be filled with soil or gravel, little landscape staples like would be used to hold down drip irrigation, or sometimes wrapped into it like lengths of 2x4 lumber, whatever you need. But if it's flapping around in the evening breeze, that soil heat is not going to accumulate and stay there. And so obviously the wider strips of sheeting that you use, the fewer seams you have, the easier it's going to be. And so here's an example. You can see where underneath the tree, they're probably using sheet mulching, and then the wider areas around it are using the solarization. You're going to find this stuff in the paint section of the local hardware store. Plastic, the thickness comes in, the unit is mil. the higher the mil, the thicker it is. So clear plastic, 4 or 6 mil will both work. 4 is kind of ideal. The slightly thinner will let more heat through actually, but it's thick enough that it will last for the amount of time. Anything thinner than this might start to break apart too quickly in the sun. And you can usually check online, like if you're looking at Home Depot or Lowe's, there will be certain sizes that they stock, but sometimes you can get a wider length if you either order it directly or special order it to the store. So for example, here it's a 20-foot width, and that wasn't available in the stores, but it was available for special order. So if you have a 20-foot or 40-foot wide area, less seams to work with. Method number 3, digging it up or physical removal. For smaller areas or for lots of people or people who are used to doing landscape work with these tools, that could just be a pick and a shovel, pulling it out one little chunk at a time. And one of the nice things about doing that is you can kind of make sure that the soil stays there, and you're just going to, if you're a homeowner, doing it a little bit at a time, green binning is the turf and as much of the roots as possible, or renting a temporary low boy green waste dumpster from whatever your waste disposal company is, and getting rid of it all in one go. And if you hire a landscaper, they might use different techniques, but sometimes they'll just show up with a bunch of people and they'll just rip the whole thing out in a couple of hours physically. Sometimes people will use a machine like this on the left, which is called a sod cutter. I'm not really in favor of it. If you do want to do it just to kind of get the level of the soil down and then follow it up with sheet mulching or solarizing, you can. The disposal costs of all of this turf and soil add up quite quickly. And even at its deepest setting, it really only goes about 2 inches down. So if you have Bermuda grass, it's really not going to get the job to get rid of the roots and prevent them from growing back. It ends up putting quite a bit of soil into the local landfills. And even if you're doing it yourself, between rental, disposal costs, the dumpster costs, I estimated that to do 1,000 square feet with a sod cutter plus disposal, it's going to end up being about $1,600 in a lot of cases. I'd rather spend my money on other stuff and just sheet mulch or solarize on top of it or physically remove it. Many more tips about this if you check out that full Removing Your Turf the Right Way workshop. And then finally, the last method that sometimes is used, whether it's by homeowners or commercial landscapes, is using herbicides. And it's not something that I recommend to homeowners, and I will mention why, but I feel it's important to cover it because if anyone goes to a local landscape supply store or to the hardware store or nursery and says, I have Bermuda grass, what do I do? They're going to hand you either Roundup or some variation of it. There's lots of off-brand names of it as well that all have the same main chemical, glyphosate. Turns out there have been many, many lawsuits, and at least in the jury trials that have awarded the plaintiffs, there are many people who now believe that this stuff causes cancer, specifically lymphoma. There's been many cases that have been won by people who have come down with these diseases after using this stuff. And just one indicator, the main manufacturer proposed to basically curtail their potential long-term costs, an $11 billion settlement, which was not resolved because they might have been liable for more. So if you decide to use herbicide, know that is something to take into account. Research and wear proper personal protective equipment, long sleeves, long pants. Don't get this stuff on you. Don't breathe it in. Don't spray when it's breezy or windy. It can blow into your neighbor's landscape or onto your other plants and either kill or harm them long term. Know that the Bermuda grass might still come back, just like any of these other methods. Usually, even the herbicides are not a silver bullet for Bermuda grass. And it's generally not effective after only one use. If there is a Bermuda grass lawn, in general, the recommendation is to apply 3, and what I've seen usually it requires at least 4 applications spaced 2 weeks apart. No water hitting the leaves for 48 hours and then watering in between to keep the kind of what will grow growing. At that point in time, it's as much time as it takes to solarize or use sheet mulch. So for most people, that's going to be a better way to go. And again, remember, check out the full workshop. If you're going to use one of these techniques, we go into way more detail. And then finally, to kind of wrap things up, and then we have plenty of time for questions. I'm happy to stay till after 8:30, is you're going to need to make some changes to your irrigation system as well. There's a lot of different ways to go. So this is really just going to be getting you to be thinking about what you might need to do and connecting you with other resources. We have not only a full retrofitting turf irrigation systems for water-wise and California native gardens, also will work for native gardens in any area, basically about how to take a little pop-up turf irrigation system and move to something that could support a diverse garden of plants of all sorts of different sizes. Have that on our YouTube page, but also a whole playlist to support that, which goes through some kind of step-by-step following my hand as I put together a drip irrigation system, do some of those conversions, explaining all of those parts. That's hours and hours of content we created for you. So this is just the kind of why and the first things to be thinking about. The reason why you're going to need to make some changes is because lawn sprinklers will pop up either 2 or 4 inches tall, just fine for turf, but in a new landscape where you have all sorts of different sizes of plants and it's more beautiful and more dynamic, these things will normally shoot directly into the closest plant, which will get way too much water, and everything else will get no water at all if it's in the middle of the landscape. And so you're going to need to make some changes. And there's a few decent options. One option, if you want to be very involved in your garden, is to just cap everything off and not have a permanent irrigation system at all. And it could be a combination of hand watering or really setting up and learning about some high efficiency kind of sprinkler attachments that you can attach to a hose, and really learning your soil, your plants, how often and how long to run them. And I talk about that in that full workshop. Good thing is that there's not much to buy. It's your cheapest option. But the drawback is that it requires you to be very involved with your landscape. For large areas of my native landscape in my backyard that after establishment, I'm only watering once a month, if that, in some areas, that's what I do. And I'm very happy with it. But I love being involved in my landscape in that way and constantly checking, looking at the plants, poking in the soil. The average person that I work with doesn't really want to do that. And so their options are retrofitting your spray system, which is what I did in my front yard, or installing a drip grid. There's also plenty of bad options. So what a lot of people end up doing, because it's sold at the local hardware store and it's cheap and easy to put in, is drip irrigation like this, where there's a wider tube and then this little, what's called spaghetti tube, 1/4 inch tube, and then these little buttons. And there's 1 or 2 of these that drip things out next to each plant. In most cases, you're asking for trouble. First thing is, my team and I have literally never gone and checked or audited a landscape where there are not multiple breaks in these systems, and some things are getting way too much water and some things have been totally disconnected. We always see that because these things are very fragile. We see things like this all the time. But the other reason is because these systems that just put water right at the base of the plant, that's great the first year, but as the water-wise plant grows, it wants to spread its roots far and wide and not have a lot of water right at the base. And so these don't support the long-term health of your garden either. It's really the opposite of what it wants over time. And so for retrofitting a spray system, that's going to be a process of taking your sprinklers in your lawn, maybe moving them a little bit if you need to, adding 1 or 2 more, making sure that the spacing is correctly. And so sprinklers are supposed to go where the stream of one sprinkler goes all the way to the next one, all the way to the next one. And there's an overlap. That's how they're engineered to work. Usually that's how they're set up. Occasionally they're set up where they just kind of only spray from one side or they just barely touch. That's not how they're set up to work. It won't be even at all. And so this is your chance to correct that. And then instead of being on the little pop-up, I put them on a taller riser, solid plastic that's tied into a piece of rebar to stabilize it, and then a little adapter, and then working with a high efficiency, it's called a high efficiency rotating nozzle, which is a much more concentrated stream of water, gets more water where it's going, and it doesn't sort of mist away in the breeze. And so it's true that you see all of these, but as soon as the garden starts growing in, most people don't actually notice them, and little birds actually perch on them. So it's kind of cool to have them around. And so that's one way of dealing with it. Those high efficiency rotating nozzles, different brands make them, and they're decent. MP rotator is the most common one that's around, and they're also a good investment, even if you're keeping a lawn area, because the watering is much more even. You'll have less brown spots. They put out water very slowly compared to traditional sprinklers, which means they need to run for much longer to put out the same volume of water. But doing so makes them more efficient as well, because the soil has more time to soak that water up and it's less likely to pool and run off. Your other option is a drip irrigation, what's called a grid system. And so this is working with a style of drip called inline drip, where you're buying a whole coil of tube. Usually it's either 100 feet or 500 feet. And the emitters are already in. So there's no little doodads or buttons to put onto them. The fittings look like this. And so if you need to change direction, they're flexible, but you can also get corner pieces and adapters. And it's not just a hole in the line. They're these highly engineered emitters. So it evens out the pressure, and they all put out the exact same amount of water at the same time if they are installed correctly with a pressure reducer and a filter. It's really the only logical way to go for a small bed like this, where sprinklers would always be sort of shooting off into the street or on the sidewalk. But in a large landscape, this is essentially what you're doing. If there's no pathways or anything like that, you're essentially still making it rain with a huge even soak that's getting the full root zone of the established landscape. It's just not spraying through the air. Or in a more typical installation where maybe you have some walkways, maybe some areas where there aren't plants, it can follow a pattern like this. Now, depending on the size and the different specifics, sometimes you can just literally unscrew your old sprinklers, cap some of them, and then have some adapters and not need to change anything at the valve. Or sometimes you will kind of do some work down on one side of the garden with still minimum PVC pipe to put in, and then run the drip from there. And so that's just kind of first things to think about. Your next step, if you're actually thinking about doing any of this stuff, would be to check out that retrofitting turf irrigation systems for Waterwise in California Native Gardens workshop. And then we'll actually use that same front yard that we used as a design case study, look at the irrigation system for the lawn I inherited and how you could plan to either, and then show you step by step how to convert it to that spray system I did, or how you would plan that out for a drip irrigation landscape and all of the different parts and pieces. And so to wrap everything up, and then I'll answer questions, I want to end with the order of things. We've presented a lot of information tonight. And so remember that you can break it down section by section, learn what you need to do, and go from there. So remember, you're going to start with your goals. What do you even want from your project? What's going to be the best, most exciting, useful yard for you? Then you're going to think about your site observations, your budget, work out your design. If you're going to hire a contractor, talk to multiple contractors, get those quotes, check references, get on their schedule. With your design as well, and once you know kind of when you're going to do the work, you can do your turf replacement rebate application if you're doing that, before you take out your turf for sure, if you're going to be doing that. And then you would get your 180 days to do that if you're doing that rebate. From there, you're going to kill your turf, prepare the site, doing any soil moving. You can dig your dry stream bed, figure out how you want to do some mounds or terraces with the extra stuff or raised beds. This, for warm season grass like Bermuda grass, is best done in the summer when it's most actively growing. You're going to do your main irrigation system work. You might do your whole irrigation system, or sometimes people who do the inline drip grids will do everything at the valve, run kind of the main hard pipe connections, but then plant right before they run those flexible lines, so they're not in the way when they're planting. From there, you're going to do your planting. If you're in our area, remember that's best done late fall to early winter, definitely by the end of March, if at all possible. And then you're going to do any final irrigation system work if you're going to be doing your drip system. And that's like right afterwards. Be ready. Don't wait a long time. It's not, I'll get to it eventually. Be ready to put that in next weekend, later that same weekend, or whatever. Then you're going to do your cleanup, your mulching, any final touches. And then you're moving into your establishment care for the garden and watching your garden grow in. That first year that the garden is growing is called establishment. And that's when plants are going to need a little bit more water still. It's going to be less water than a lawn immediately, but it's still going to want more water than eventually it's going to get. Sometimes for some plants, there's a little bit of early pruning you can do to really make sure that it gets a nice form and nice growth. And so one thing, if you're going to be doing the work yourself, that I also really suggest that you take a look at, especially if you've never done this before, is we have an installation and establishment of water-wise and native plants workshop. In addition, for any of you who are local, very soon we are going to have, in fact, a week from Saturday, we are going to have our first all outdoor, distance safe and masked, but all outdoor workshop in a long time in our demonstration garden, which is selecting and planting water-wise and native plants. We'll look at how to choose plants from the nursery. We'll do planting demonstrations, and we'll look at like the different little microclimates and sites in our demonstration garden that you might be needing to select for in your garden. For those of you who aren't local, we also have a version of that online on our YouTube page. And so that's where we will leave it with this introductory crash course. Thank you very much. I know I've gone a little bit over. I appreciate you staying with us. It's a lot of information to try to perfectly get into 2.5 hours. And what I'm going to do as I move into answering any of the last questions is I just launched this very quick closing poll. If you could please give me some feedback, I'd really appreciate it. It's very important. We're always trying to learn how to do our job better here. And in addition to the closing poll questions, please, I love feedback in the chat. I'm always looking to trim down this workshop some to make it a little bit shorter. So if there's anything that you learned that you know is going to be super useful to you, I'd love to know what that is in the chat. And also, if there's anything that you're hoping to learn tonight and I didn't cover, or something that didn't work for you, then please let me know as well, because I'm always tweaking things and trying to improve. And so with that, I will move into answering the questions. And if you have some more questions, you can type them into the Q&A now, and I still have some time to hang out and answering them. Okay, let's see. So question from Mark. Do you have to remove all the grass to dirt before you water and cover with plastic when solarizing? Is there a minimum temp before you start solarizing? Great questions. You absolutely don't have to remove the grass to dirt before you solarize, and most of the time people do not. They leave the grass there. Now, if you have, so your solarization is going to, depending on how much heat you accumulate, is going to warm the soil, down as far as it can. And so the farther that heat can penetrate into the soil, the better. So if you have a lawn that's developed like multiple inches of thatch over time, and the turf level is really high above the soil, what you might do is like mow it on the lowest setting, or sometimes I'll do that first, and then I'll even take like a string trimmer and really go at it to kind of just scalp it as much as I can and kind of rake things away. But I won't physically remove the turf, just kind of crop it down as much as is possible without going overboard and making too much work for myself. And that'll let the plastic get a little bit closer to the soil surface and increase the temperatures without having to fully remove it. For me, I just don't find it worth the work and the disposal to fully remove turf before I would normally take on a project, unless it's really small. Because I'm also doing it by myself and my back's not as good as it used to be. Certainly, if you do remove it all, you will be able to get that heat to penetrate deeper into the soil, but most people will not go that far. Okay, from Jeannie, is this presentation going to be available later online? Yes, absolutely. So I have recorded this. Probably in about a week or so, after some light editing, it will be posted online. However, an earlier version of this workshop, which is largely the same content, slightly different in the design example, is available online right now on our YouTube page. And I'll just type that in. I mentioned it, but just so it's here for you to reference. cbwcd.org/YouTube will get you right there. Okay, from Sharon. I'd like to use sheet mulching to smother my weedy, patchy lawn. Then I want to plant Carapia. Could I put a thick layer of compost on the cardboard, then plant the Carapia? No, that's not going to work. Well, for the Carapia, because it roots so quickly, probably for the sod or the plugs, I wouldn't try it. Honestly, if you're going to plant Carapia, which normally comes from little plugs or sod, it's a kind of turf replacement alternative. Really the best thing to do, because for that as well, for like those real turf replacements, you really want a nice even level. It's not like planting kind of shrubs and things like that, where there's going to be a thick layer of mulch, and it doesn't really matter if the soil surface is perfectly even. The proper prep for Carapia would be just like you are redoing turf, which would mean probably digging up the lawn physically, then either seeing what regrows and physically removing it again until it stops, or solarizing and then putting down the Carapia. So that's going to be some work. The prep for that is definitely going to be more than for the typical landscape, and might be better done by a landscaper who does that sort of work regularly. Okay, what is the minimum average temperature before covering with plastic? In the 80s? Yeah, probably. I've never seen anything that really quantifies that. It's a great question. I wish I knew the answer. But normally it's kind of considered a couple of months in the peak of summer. So yeah, I would consider it 80s. You're really what will kill roots and seeds in the soil is 140 degrees. And so basically you need to be able to get the soil up to over 140 degrees, a number of inches deep. And so if you really want to quantify it and get into it, figure it out, I guess you can use an inexpensive like a meat thermometer. That should probably give you a reading and be able to go down a few inches. Sharon, does Carapia qualify for the turf replacement rebate? Okay, there is no specific yes or no officially on any specific plant. What they say for the turf replacement rebate is that you are not supposed to have turf-like looking plants. And so there are certain things like yarrow. My first design I did that integrates Carapia, even though honestly Carapia is not really my favorite. We do have some in our demonstration garden. Is that you can't have anything that looks like turf. And so for Carapia, for yarrow, for another common one, Western meadow sedge, you can mow them or you can not mow them and let them be a little bit more natural. What they might be looking for you to tell them is that you are not going to regularly mow it. And so even though it's kind of going down as sod or as plugs, that it's not going to really look exactly like turf long-term is what they would be looking for to hopefully approve it. And so that will hopefully help. And I would definitely say, you know, unmown Carapia meadow or something like that on your application to kind of explain the intent. Okay, from Nicole. Are you able to mention a few good contractors in Chino or Inland Empire area? So as a public agency, we don't make official recommendations. However, I do have a small list, which I am hoping to get longer over time, of landscapers and contractors who have installed for people who have participated in our landscape design program, and they have had good experiences with them. So it's not an endorsement, but it's just sharing that information. And I will put into the chat the email address that we use for our design assistance program, which is checked by me as well as one of my other team members. It's just design@cbwcd.org. If you email that email address and mention that you are hoping for that list of contractors, then I can share with you the information that we do have to share for people putting in water-wise gardens in this area. Okay, from Jeannie. In Redlands, what are my free or low-cost landscape design resources? That's a good question. Our program is very unique. We are a unique agency because of the history of where we happen to be and that we are a water conservation district. And in addition to that, we happen to have 2 people with backgrounds in landscape design on our staff. And so it's not a common program to have a program like that. The couple of things you might do if you are looking for lower cost options would be, I mean, sometimes you get what you pay for. Redlands is not that close to any schools I know that do landscape design, but you might contact like Cal Poly Pomona and Mount San Antonio College. I know they have horticulture programs, and see if there's any students that are looking for projects. But quite honestly, I feel like the average homeowner, if they're willing to do the research, can do just as good of a job, if not a better job than most students, because you're going to know what you're looking for and your site better. You can always talk to local nurseries, but landscape design is a skill set that experience is needed to get decent at it. And so with that, people are looking to get compensated for skills normally, is what I would say. Depending on, if you're going to be hiring a contractor, sometimes contractors that specialize in this will include landscape design as well. So it'll be kind of a package deal. Okay, from Sharon, why is Carapia not my favorite? So some people really like it. For me, compared to a couple of other California native alternatives, which are yarrow and western meadow sedge, in our demonstration garden, although Carapia has sort of from a traditional formal landscape look, kind of the cleanest flat green plain look. So if that's what you're really looking for, you might still want to do Carapia. But compared to yarrow and western meadow sedge, which are my other go-tos, or even buffalo grass, in our landscape, there's been a little bit more weed regrowth in Carapia, so kind of requiring some additional management. And I prefer, even if it's kind of a low area, kind of a more wild, wispy, naturalistic look that can be accomplished with some of the California native alternatives. But that's just me. But yeah, I mean, we're going to continue to have Carapia in our demonstration garden. Some people really like it. Somebody just installed Carapia sod as part of their landscape that we helped them with for the landscape design program. Okay, I think that gets us through everything. Oh, I see one more from, if Jeannie's still there, from the early on. Have a southern exposure, which is a vegetable garden. Looking for info on trees to plant to provide shade to the house, sited so that veggies have adequate sun, but the house has shade. Is that, so that would be a tree to plant. If you're looking for a tree to plant in between the vegetable beds and the house, then maybe you're looking at a smaller tree, which will shade maybe the wall of the house, but won't be tall enough to shade the actual roof. It won't be super wide. If that's the case, you might look at, for our kind of Southern California area, desert willow would certainly be one of my go-tos. And you can also look at Desert Museum Palo Verde. So V2, they're small enough that you can kind of keep them pruned, but large enough that they will provide some shade and even a little bit of shade to the roof, but won't be like really huge, taking up the whole yard. Yeah, so hopefully that helps. And I think that gets us through everything. It's time for me to say goodnight. Thank you very much for spending your evening with us. And please sign up for our newsletter. Come visit us at our demonstration garden in Montclair if you're local, and join us for other workshops. Have a good evening, everybody.